Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history doesn't shout, it whispers. Tonight, we step into the quiet world of a man who never sought fame, but ruled an empire that stretched across the American underworld. His name was Russell Bufalino, the silent architect of the Mafia. While others made headlines with bullets and bravado, Bufalino built power through patience, diplomacy, and fear. He wasn't the face of the mob. He was its invisible hand. So before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there right now? We love seeing this global underworld of listeners grow, one story at a time. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on the bell, so you never miss another journey into the dark, whispered corridors of organized crime. Now, take a slow breath. Let the noise of the day fade away, and sink with us into the life of a man who ruled from the shadows. Russell Bufalino, the most powerful mobster of the American Mafia. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. Origins in Sicily. Under the dim Sicilian sun, in a town carved from dust and silence, a boy was born who would one day pull the strings of the American Mafia without ever raising his voice. It was 1903 in Monodoro, a cluster of crumbling houses clinging to the hills of Caltanissetta, where life was measured in harvests and whispers. The villagers said the earth itself was tired here. Men worked the sulfur mines until their lungs turned to ash, and women prayed not for riches, but for another year without famine. From this hunger, from this stillness, came Russell Bufalino, a child whose destiny would reach across oceans, building an empire from shadows. Imagine him years later, sitting alone in a smoke-filled diner in Pennsylvania, the faint hum of a jukebox behind him, his eyes calm and unreadable as the FBI watched from a parked car outside. They had no idea that this quiet man in a plain suit once crawled barefoot through Sicilian dust, that his silence was forged in a land where speaking too much could get you killed. But that moment, decades later, all began here, in the heart of Sicily. Monodoro was not a place for dreamers. It was a village strangled by poverty and ruled by unwritten laws older than any government. Men settled scores not in courtrooms, but in courtyards. Secrets didn't die. They just sank deeper into the limestone. For a child like Russell, the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who could be trusted and those who could not. The rest was noise. His father, Angelo, worked long hours as a miner, a thin man with calloused hands and eyes that carried the weight of the hills. His mother, Christina, stitched clothes for neighbors to keep the family fed. Every morning, she sent Russell out to fetch water from the well, warning him not to talk to strangers. In this town, she would whisper, "Silence keeps you alive." It was more than advice. It was survival. Even before he could read, Russell learned the language of silence. When men gathered in the square to argue about land or honor, he noticed how no one said a word unless it mattered. When a neighbor disappeared after crossing the wrong man, the town didn't mourn. It looked away. These moments carved lessons into him deeper than any schooling could. He grew up believing that the strongest man wasn't the loudest, but the one who never had to explain himself. Sicily, after the Great War, was a place of ghosts. The land had been bled dry by years of conscription, hunger, and neglect. Soldiers came home to nothing. No work, no hope, no peace. Bandits roamed the countryside, robbing caravans and punishing the rich. In the distance, the church bells rang not for weddings, but for the dead. Out of this chaos, the old Sicilian code of honor, omerta, became more than tradition. It was law. Never speak. Never confess. Never betray. For a boy like Russell, those lessons became the blueprint of manhood. Loyalty was sacred. Vengeance was private. Justice belonged to those strong enough to take it. He didn't yet know that this same code, born in the dusty alleys of Monodoro, would later shape the backbone of American organized crime. When Russell was 10, whispers spread through the village that another family had left for America. They said there were streets paved with gold there, though no one who returned ever confirmed it. His father began to talk about leaving too, though he did so quietly, almost fearfully, as if the idea itself might curse them. By 1914, war was once again swallowing Europe, and the promise of safety across the ocean became irresistible. On the morning they left, the air smelled of rain and coal smoke. Russell clutched his mother's hand as they walked toward the port. He looked back once at the crumbling hills, at the church bell tower leaning slightly to one side, and at the narrow alleys where he'd learned to keep his head down. He didn't cry. He just memorized it. Every crack, every shadow, like a man taking mental inventory before leaving a place forever. The ship that carried them to America was packed with hundreds of families, each chasing their own version of salvation. The journey took weeks. The air below deck was thick with sweat and sickness, and the sound of babies crying echoed endlessly through the dark. Russell barely spoke. He just watched. He watched how men argued over space, how others hoarded bread, and how a single kind word could calm a crowd. He studied people the way other boys studied books. When they finally reached New York Harbor, the skyline looked like another world. The Statue of Liberty was not a symbol to him. It was a question. Freedom for what? To start over, or to survive in a new kind of jungle? His family settled first in Buffalo, in the Italian neighborhood where the streets were narrow and the air smelled of coal, garlic, and ambition. The men here worked the railroads or the docks by day, and some found other ways to earn by night. To young Russell, the city was chaos. Everyone was shouting, in Sicilian, Neapolitan English. The noise felt like madness, but within it he sensed a rhythm. The loud ones fought for scraps. The quiet ones watched, waited, and rose. That was the rule he recognized, even in America. He grew into a lean, watchful teenager, polite, invisible, and always listening. He worked odd jobs, shining shoes and delivering packages, sometimes for men who wore good suits but never smiled. He saw money move in envelopes, saw respect paid with nods, not words. In this new country, he recognized something familiar, a new version of Sicily's code, hidden beneath the surface. By his late teens, Russell had learned to navigate two worlds. To outsiders, he was another hard-working immigrant. But to those in the neighborhood, he was a boy who understood loyalty. When a man from the old country got into trouble with a rival gang, Russell didn't ask questions. He simply delivered a message, quiet and efficient. No drama, no noise. The older men noticed. America after the war was changing fast. Prohibition was turning liquor into gold, and men who once labored for pennies now built empires from illegal bottles. Across the cities, Italian gangs merged, split, and fought for control. Yet in the midst of this frenzy, Russell remained calm, deliberate, like a chess player watching a dozen pieces move before making a single move of his own. But long before he became a name whispered in mob circles, he was still that boy from Monodoro, shaped by hunger, silence, and tradition. When the world around him shouted for attention, he chose to disappear into the background. That was his genius. While others built reputations, he built leverage. There was a saying among Sicilian elders, "A knife never speaks before it cuts." Russell lived by that. Every favor he granted, every debt he collected, was part of a system of quiet exchange. If you owed him, you remembered. If he owed you, he never forgot. His power would later come not from fear alone, but from memory, from the simple fact that he always kept his word, even when that word was unspoken. Through the 1920s, waves of immigrants continued to pour into America. Many carried the same hunger and defiance that had driven the Bufalinos across the Atlantic. But Russell's family remained small, private, avoiding the gossip and violence that consumed other neighborhoods. His father worked honest labor, but Russell's eyes were already elsewhere, drawn to the men who controlled the unions, the ports, the flow of goods. He could see patterns others missed. The real power, he realized, didn't come from owning something. It came from controlling who had access to it. When he visited church on Sundays, he watched priests bless men who had killed the night before. The contradiction didn't confuse him. It clarified the world. He understood that good and evil weren't opposite forces. They were simply two tools in the same trade. What mattered was how quietly you used them. By the time he was in his early 20s, Russell had earned a reputation that couldn't be bought: reliability. He never complained, never asked for more than what was promised, and never betrayed a confidence. These were small virtues in a world of criminals, but they built the foundation of something rare: trust. That trust caught the attention of bigger men, names that would later dominate the headlines. But for now, Russell stayed invisible. He preferred it that way. Power, he'd already learned, was safest when unseen. Sometimes, late at night, he'd walk alone through the narrow streets of Buffalo, thinking of Sicily. The same moon that hung over Montedoro now glowed above the smokestacks of New York. He wondered if silence meant the same thing here, if the rules of omerta still applied in a land of noise and neon. He found his answer not in words, but in the way men behaved when the law came knocking. Nobody talked, not to the police, not to the papers. The code had survived the ocean. It had simply adapted, dressing itself in American suits and speaking through the language of deals. In those quiet walks, Russell began forming the philosophy that would define his reign decades later. You don't need to be seen to be obeyed. Fear and respect were currencies that could flow silently, like money through invisible hands. Sometimes, when he passed by groups of loud young men boasting about their rackets or showing off their new cars, he'd give a faint smile, not of envy, but of certainty. He knew their kind wouldn't last. The ones who shouted the loudest were always the first to fall. He lived with his parents until his mid-20s, never rushing to build his own household. He moved like a man waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows. In that waiting, he refined himself, learned to listen to tone, to read the space between words. It was said later that when Russell Bufalino looked at you, he didn't just see what you were saying. He saw what you were afraid to say. The old ways of Sicily lived on inside him. The church, the family dinners, the unspoken hierarchy of respect. But something darker had also taken root, a belief that silence could be sharper than any blade. In Montedoro, it had kept him alive. In America, it would make him untouchable. Years later, men who serve him would say they could never read him. He could be kind, even fatherly, and then turn cold in an instant, like a candle blown out in a dark room. That duality was not an act. It was the result of two worlds colliding inside one man: the poverty of Sicily and the opportunity of America. The code of the old world welded to the ambition of the new. And yet, beneath all his discipline and caution, there was something else: a quiet rage at the humiliation of his early years, the hunger that never left his bones. He would spend his life building power, not for luxury, but for control, to never again depend on anyone else's mercy. By the end of the 1920s, the young immigrant from Montedoro was no longer just another face in the crowd. He had become a whisper in the backrooms of Buffalo and Pennsylvania, a man you called when you wanted things done cleanly, quietly, and without witnesses. He was still invisible to the world, but those who mattered already knew his name. And as America roared into a new decade, with bootleg whiskey, new fortunes, and new betrayals, Russell Bufalino was ready to rise. The Sicilian boy who learned silence at a mother's knee was about to turn that silence into power. But power always comes with a price. And soon, the quiet man from Montedoro would learn that even silence can echo loud enough to wake the dead. Chapter 2. The Early Years in America. The winter wind in Buffalo was cruel, cutting through the narrow streets where the smoke from the factories never cleared. For most, this was the land of opportunity, but for the Bufalino family, it was survival by inches. The dreams they carried from Sicily melted quickly into the cold grime of America. Russell, now a small boy in a city that didn't care who you were unless you could prove you mattered, learned early that the promise of America was written in fine print, and silence was still the safest language to speak. He grew up surrounded by noise, the shouts of street vendors, the clang of streetcars, the hiss of steam escaping from laundries. But beneath that sound, there was an undercurrent, a rhythm he could hear even as a child. Men moving goods after dark, neighbors exchanging small envelopes in doorways, whispers that the law was blind if you knew who to pay. It wasn't much different from Sicily. Only here, the suits were cleaner, the stakes higher, and the accents mixed together like the smoke in the air. The immigrant quarter of Buffalo was a place of contradictions, misery and ambition living side by side. On one street corner, a priest gave blessings in broken English. On the next, men argued in dialects of Naples and Palermo over who controlled which block. Russell watched from the edges, his dark eyes taking in everything. He wasn't drawn to the violence, but to the organization of it, how even chaos had structure when it was profitable. His father worked at the rail yards, hands cracked and blackened by oil. His mother kept the home tidy, a small fortress of order in a world that spun too fast. Russell saw in them the dignity of struggle, but also its limits. Hard work might keep you alive, but didn't make you powerful. He began to understand the quiet hierarchy that ruled their neighborhood. The landlords who never seemed to age, the shop owners who never seemed to worry, and the men who walked into bars alone and never paid for their drinks. He was 12 when he got his first job shining shoes near the train station. Every morning, he polished the boots of men in expensive coats who spoke softly and tipped generously. They wore diamond rings that glinted in the dim light, but their eyes were tired, watchful, like his father's, but sharper. They never hurried, even when the world around them did. Russell noticed the way people moved aside for them without being asked. That kind of respect, he realized, didn't come from fear alone. It came from a reputation that needed no introduction. He carried their faces in his memory. Years later, when he'd rise among men like them, he'd remember how they spoke, how they never said more than necessary, how their smallest gestures carried weight. But back then, he was just a quiet kid with steady hands and a polite nod. And that was fine. Invisible people could see everything. The world around him was changing faster than anyone could understand. Prohibition was tightening its grip on America. Bars went dark, and the business of illegal liquor exploded overnight. For most, it was a crisis. For some, it was an empire waiting to be built. The Italian and Irish gangs carved territories across the industrial cities, and the streets ran with more than rainwater. Russell was too young to join, but not too young to observe. He saw the local police take bribes without blinking. He saw drunks stumble out of backroom speakeasies while politicians preached morality in daylight. He saw hypocrisy not as a sin, but as a fact of life, something to be managed, not fought. It was here, in the gray morality of a booming America, that his Sicilian instincts found new purpose. By 16, he had a reputation for being dependable. When a neighbor needed help delivering packages, he didn't ask questions. The man paid in cash, always on time, and told him never to look inside. Russell didn't. Curiosity, he'd learned, was the first step toward trouble. Instead, he focused on doing things right, on showing up early, keeping quiet, and remembering every detail. The man noticed. One evening, he asked Russell if he wanted real work, steady pay, no questions. Russell said yes. That night, he found himself in the back of a warehouse filled with wooden crates. The air smelled like sugar and yeast. Bootleg whiskey. The men unloading it worked with precision, moving quickly but never rushing. Everyone knew their role. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Russell fit in instantly. He wasn't the strongest or the loudest, but he was efficient, a ghost in motion. And in the underworld, efficiency was as valuable as muscle. The man who brought him in, a mid-level associate from New York, told him afterward, "You don't talk much." That's good. The loud ones never last. Russell just nodded. He didn't need praise. What mattered was that someone had noticed what he'd spent years perfecting, the art of disappearing in plain sight. Over time, he learned how shipments moved through the city, how money flowed from speakeasies to warehouse bosses, then up the ladder to men he never met but heard about in whispers. It was a pyramid of trust and silence. He never saw the top, but he knew it existed, and one day he intended to climb it. At night, when he walked home, He passed the same alleyways he used to play in as a child. The laughter was gone now, replaced by muffled voices and the metallic click of pistols being checked before a deal. Buffalo was no longer the hopeful immigrant town it once pretended to be. It had become an economy of shadows, and Russell, still in his teens, was already a small part of it. He didn't brag about his work to anyone, not even his parents. His mother thought he was helping at the docks, and in a way, she wasn't wrong. He justified it quietly to himself. The money he brought home bought food, clothes, stability. If sin had a purpose, it didn't feel like sin anymore. By his late teens, the small operations turned into real jobs. He started running errands between Buffalo and Scranton, Pennsylvania, carrying messages, cash, and occasionally, something heavier. These trips were tests, and Russell passed everyone. He never asked who he was working for, and he never failed to deliver. Each success added a layer to his growing reputation. A reputation for reliability in a business built on betrayal. The men he worked for changed, but one thing didn't: their respect for him. Older gangsters began referring to him as the kid who doesn't talk. It wasn't an insult. In fact, in their world, it was one of the highest compliments you could receive. During one delivery, a small-time enforcer tried to test him, asked where he was heading, tried to get a laugh out of him. Russell just stared back with calm, unreadable eyes until the man looked away. That moment stuck with people. In a world of bluster, a man who could intimidate without saying a word was something rare. Meanwhile, across the country, the Mafia was evolving. Immigrant street gangs were merging into organized families, and the old Sicilian traditions were mixing with American pragmatism. The rules were being rewritten. You no longer needed to carry a gun to command respect. You needed connections, strategy, and the discipline to stay invisible. Russell had all three, even if he didn't yet realize their value. He moved from petty errands to managing routes, making sure shipments arrived untouched, that payments were made on time, and that problems were handled quietly. When two drivers started fighting over territory, he didn't raise his voice or threaten them. He simply replaced them with men who didn't argue. The message was clear: efficiency over ego. This calm authority began to draw attention from bigger figures, men connected to the Megadino family in Buffalo and the Pittston crowd in Pennsylvania. They didn't see him as a threat, but as an asset, someone who could be trusted with delicate matters. When a shipment went missing in 1925, and everyone was panicking, Russell was the one who found out what happened. He didn't interrogate. He listened, pieced things together, and discovered that the loss wasn't theft, but a simple miscommunication between drivers. He fixed it quietly, without drawing attention. The bosses like that. In the underworld, a man who solved problems without creating new ones was worth gold. The same year, America changed again. Prohibition was no longer just business. It was war. Irish, Jewish, and Italian gangs fought for control of cities like Chicago and New York. Blood ran in alleys, and headlines screamed of massacres. But Buffalo and Scranton were different. They were quieter, not because they lacked ambition, but because men like Bufalino believed that silence was the sharpest weapon. He kept his circle small, his movements smaller. He wasn't interested in making a name for himself, only in building a network of people who owed him favors. And favors, he would later say, were the only real currency that never lost value. Every once in a while, he'd return home late and find his mother waiting, a rosary in her hands. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't have to. In the old country, wives and mothers learned that knowing too much could be dangerous. She only said, "Be careful, Russell. Don't forget who you are." He'd kiss her forehead, promise quietly, and then return to a life where names and promises meant everything and nothing. By the late 1920s, he had outgrown the small-time operations. The Prohibition world had matured, becoming a corporate underworld with distribution networks, accountants, and silent partners in politics. Russell's quiet efficiency earned him introductions to men who operated at that level. One of them, a businessman from Pennsylvania with ties to garment unions, took a liking to him. The man admired Russell's calm, saying, "You've got something rare, the patience to wait for the storm to pass instead of trying to fight it. Russell just smiled. He knew storms always passed, and when they did, they left space for new kings. The Great Depression hit soon after, and while the rest of the country starved, the underworld adapted. Smuggling and racketeering didn't depend on Wall Street. People still drank, still gambled, still sought favors. Money kept moving, quietly, invisibly. Russell moved with it, learning how to control not just the routes, but the relationships that kept those routes alive. He wasn't a boss yet, but he was already thinking like one. Men around him were falling, killed, imprisoned, betrayed. But Russell endured. He had no known enemies, no outbursts, no unnecessary risks. When he spoke, people listened, not because they feared him, but because they respected the weight behind his silence. He became the man others confided in, asked for advice, or sought to mediate disputes. The qualities that made him invisible as a child now made him indispensable as a man. He began to drift toward Pennsylvania permanently, settling in Pittston, a small coal mining town where the old country Italians had carved out their own corner of America. It reminded him of Sicily, the same hills, the same closeness of family, the same unspoken rules. It was there that his legend truly began. But back then, standing in the chill of another Pennsylvania dawn, he was just a young man with a clear gaze and steady hands, walking the line between law and loyalty. He didn't yet know that one day he'd be the man other dawns turned to for permission, that his word would ripple through the mafia like scripture. He only knew that silence still worked, in America, just as it had in Sicily. And as the last embers of Prohibition flickered out, Russell Bufalino was ready to trade the shadows of backroom warehouses for the deeper, quieter corridors of real power. The boy from Monodoro was gone. In his place stood a man who could bend the world without ever raising his voice. And soon, the underworld would learn what that truly meant, because somewhere in Pennsylvania, an empire was about to awaken, and it would speak only in whispers. Chapter 3. The Prohibition Underground. The first bottle shattered in the dark, and Russell didn't flinch. It was a cold night on the edge of Scranton in 1921, the kind of night where steam rose from every man's breath like ghosts climbing out of their lungs. Somewhere behind the warehouse, police sirens wailed, far away but not far enough. The men moved quickly, breaking open crates and rolling barrels into the river. One shouted in panic, another cursed in Sicilian. And through it all, Russell Bufalino stayed silent, his eyes calm, steady, calculating. He wasn't afraid. He was observing, measuring how chaos tested a man's character. And in that moment, he saw what most never noticed. Panic was louder than danger, and fear only made you visible. By the time the sirens faded and the men scattered into the alleys, Russell had learned something vital. The liquor might change hands, the police might win a battle, but control belonged to whoever could stay composed when the world cracked open. That night, in the silence after the storm, he began his quiet ascent through America's Prohibition underworld. He was in his late teens, not yet a man, but already older than his years. The Prohibition Act had transformed every thirsty citizen into a potential customer, and every clever immigrant into a potential millionaire. Across the country, the law had turned morality into a business opportunity. Speakeasies bloomed like weeds in every city, and law enforcement, underpaid, underfed, and often under the influence, could barely keep up. For the first time, crime was organized not around violence, but around logistics. And logistics, that was Russell's language. In Buffalo and Scranton, the bootlegging network was expanding fast. Whiskey flowed in from Canada, rum from the Caribbean, and homemade gin from basements that smelled of rot and sugar. The streets weren't ruled by kings. They were ruled by the men who could move product quietly. While others chased power with guns, Russell found it in precision. He didn't need to be feared yet. He only needed to be trusted. He started as a runner, but it didn't take long for him to move higher. He was the one who never lost a shipment, never brought attention, never drank on the job. When the trucks broke down, he knew which mechanic wouldn't ask questions. When the routes got raided, he knew which cop to tip, just enough to look the other way. Every crisis that ruined another man's operation became his opportunity to prove he was indispensable. The men he worked for noticed. One of them, an older Sicilian known only as the Baker, brought Russell into his circle. The Baker wasn't a gangster in the flashy sense. He owned a bakery on the main street by day and a warehouse by night. His bread was famous, but his liquor was legendary. The Baker saw in Russell a reflection of the old Sicilian discipline: silent, loyal, and terrifyingly patient. "You don't need to speak," he told him once. "The smartest man in the room is usually the one who lets others fill the air." Under the Baker's wing, Russell learned the deeper structure of the underworld. He studied how decisions were made, how disputes were settled, how loyalty was tested. The Mafia wasn't just about muscle. It was about management. Every shipment was a business deal. Every favor was an investment. And Russell, who'd grown up watching the order behind Sicilian chaos, understood that better than anyone. By 1923, the Buffalo underworld was divided among families, each claiming pieces of the smuggling routes. The Megadino family dominated the region, its influence stretching from the Great Lakes to Pennsylvania. Most men tried to attach themselves to powerful names like that, but not Russell. He kept his distance, orbiting around power without becoming trapped in it. He built relationships laterally, not upward. Truckers, warehouse owners, dock workers, and even customs clerks who liked to gamble. These were not glamorous allies, but they were the backbone of every operation. Russell knew that the ones who handled the dirty work often knew the most, and if you treated them with respect, they'd remember. He developed a reputation that made even seasoned men take notice. They called him the quiet Sicilian, and when he entered a room, conversation often stopped for a moment, not out of fear, but from curiosity. He carried himself with the calm assurance of someone who knew exactly where the invisible lines were. He didn't interrupt. He waited, and when he finally spoke, his words came slow, deliberate, each one landing with weight. He rarely needed to threaten anyone. A glance was enough. It wasn't what he said. It was what others imagined he might do. The Prohibition years turned Russell into something rare, a man who could operate across families without ever being seen as a traitor. He became the thread that wove through different territories, connecting suppliers in New York with distributors in Pennsylvania, brokers in New Jersey with smugglers on the Canadian border. He wasn't the face of any operation, but every operation seemed to depend on him. One cold morning, the Baker called him to a meeting at the back of his bakery. The smell of fresh bread masked the tension in the air. Two men from another crew had been caught skimming money from shipments. They stood with their hands clasped, waiting for judgment. The Baker looked to Russell. "What do you think?" he asked, testing him. Russell didn't answer immediately. He studied the men, their nervous eyes darting to the floor. "If you kill them," he said finally, "you lose 2 workers and gain 2 ghosts. Better to make them owe you." The Baker raised an eyebrow, but followed his advice. The men were spared, but they never forgot who'd saved them. Years later, they'd still send envelopes to Russell every Christmas. Loyalty paid dividends longer than blood ever did. By his mid-20s, Russell was more than an errand boy. He had quietly become a decision-maker, though few realized it. He negotiated prices, arranged meetings, and smoothed out conflicts before they turned violent. In an era defined by loud gangsters with Tommy guns, he was the calm in the storm, the man who understood that killing a rival was easy, but keeping the business alive afterward was the hard part. Still, violence was never far away. One night, a rival outfit ambushed a convoy outside Scranton. 2 drivers were shot dead, and several barrels went missing. The next morning, the Baker demanded retribution. But before he could act, Russell suggested patience. "Find out who they sold the whiskey to," he said. "When we know that, we'll own them without firing a shot." Weeks later, when the stolen liquor appeared in another city's market, Russell traced it to a distributor secretly working both sides. The Baker reclaimed his money, took the rival's customers, and avoided a war. After that, even the hot-headed gangsters started to defer to the kid. Behind the scenes, Prohibition was starting to crack. The public had grown tired of the hypocrisy. By the late 1920s, the law was a joke, and organized crime had evolved into a business empire. The Mafia wasn't just selling liquor anymore. It was investing in construction, trucking, and unions. Russell moved with it, shifting from smuggling to logistics, from risk to control. He started to travel between Buffalo, New York, and Pittston, Pennsylvania more frequently. Pittston's coal industry was in decline, but its strategic position made it perfect for moving goods through small towns and rural roads untouched by federal agents. It was here that Russell began to build what would later become his personal domain. He met men who would become lifelong allies: drivers, factory foremen, local politicians who liked to gamble but hated publicity. The lessons of Sicily had fully merged with the realities of America. In Sicily, men ruled by reputation. In America, they ruled by efficiency. Russell embodied both. He wasn't the kind of boss who demanded loyalty. He inspired it. His calmness under pressure, his precision with money, his quiet empathy for the men beneath him, they all made him different. He didn't humiliate, he corrected. He didn't intimidate, he reminded. But the world was changing faster than anyone could control. The stock market crashed in 1929, and the Great Depression spread like a plague. Legitimate businesses collapsed overnight, but the underworld thrived. Desperation made men reckless, and Russell saw opportunity in that chaos. He expanded quietly, offering loans to struggling businesses through intermediaries. Some repaid him, some didn't, but all became dependent. It was the beginning of his web, the foundation of what would become one of the most quietly powerful criminal networks in the country. In those years, many mobsters were drawn to fame. Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Dutch Schultz. They craved headlines, photographs, the illusion of invincibility. Russell saw it differently. Fame was a spotlight, and spotlights burned. While others chased glory, he perfected invisibility. His name rarely appeared in police reports, his face never in newspapers. He wasn't the man giving orders in public. He was the man those public figures went to for advice when no one was looking. There was a moment, years later, that would define him forever. In 1931, the Mafia underwent a violent transformation, the Castellamarese War. Bosses were being gunned down in streets from Brooklyn to Chicago, and the old Sicilian guard was being replaced by a younger, more modern generation led by Charles Lucky Luciano. The chaos reached even into Pennsylvania, where small-time families debated who to back. Russell didn't pick sides. He stayed still, let the blood run its course, and waited for the dust to settle. When it did, the ones who'd survived noticed something remarkable. The quiet man from Pittston hadn't lost a single soldier or shipment. He was one of the few who emerged stronger without firing a shot. His restraint earned him respect in circles that once barely knew his name. The Megadino family in Buffalo saw him as reliable. The Pittston and Scranton networks began deferring to him for mediation. Without ever declaring it, Russell Bufalino had become the invisible center of power connecting multiple crime families across state lines. When Prohibition finally ended in 1933, most bootleggers panicked. Their cash cow was gone, their networks useless. But not Russell. He saw it coming and had already shifted his focus. The same trucks that once carried liquor now carried textiles, cigarettes, and goods bound for New York and New Jersey. The same union men who once guarded warehouses now handled labor disputes. The infrastructure stayed intact. Only the product changed. In the years to come, that foresight would make him one of the most enduring figures in organized crime. A man whose empire survived every purge, every reform, every generation. But for now, he remained in the background, quietly watching as others fought for the throne. Sometimes when the night was too still, he'd remember that first broken bottle in the dark. The sirens, the shouting, the panic. That chaos had taught him everything he needed to know. The loud ones never lasted. The world belonged to those who could remain calm when everything else fell apart. He'd carried that silence from Sicily to Buffalo to Pittston, and it had carried him further than any bullet ever could. Yet he also knew that silence could become its own kind of noise, the kind that drew the attention of men who feared what they couldn't see. And somewhere, in the distant hum of a car engine parked outside a warehouse, the future was already watching him. The young Sicilian who'd learned to master the shadows was about to meet the men who ruled them. And when he did, the quiet underworld of Pennsylvania would never be the same again. Chapter 4. The quiet power broker emerges. The rain had been falling for hours, soft and relentless, washing the soot off the rooftops of Scranton like a confession whispered to no one. Inside a dimly lit cafe, a man sat alone at a corner table, his coat still damp from the walk, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers. His name was Russell Bufalino. To most, he looked like another tired immigrant with too many worries and too little time. But that night, two men entered quietly, glanced his way, and walked back out without saying a word. They didn't need to. A single nod from him had been enough. Decisions were being made, and he no longer needed to raise his voice to make them happen. By the early 1930s, the chaos of Prohibition had given birth to a new kind of order. The bootleggers who'd survived the gunfire and betrayals of the previous decade were now businessmen. Smugglers became transporters, enforcers became managers, and the smartest of them all, men like Bufalino, became something rarer, architects of silence. The war for the streets had ended. The war for influence had begun. Russell had already built his reputation as the man who could fix anything quietly. If a shipment went missing, he found it. If a rival made threats, he made them vanish, not with violence, but with precision. His calmness unnerved people because it suggested knowledge they didn't have. He understood that fear didn't come from shouting. It came from the space between sentences, from what people imagined when he said nothing at all. In Scranton and Pittston, factories churned through cold dust and sweat, but the real money was moving through union deals and trucking contracts. It was a world where blue-collar labor met organized control. Russell didn't bully his way in. He seeped in, like water finding cracks in stone. He offered protection where the law was useless, fairness where management was cruel, and discretion where others demanded attention. It wasn't long before local business owners began to see him not as a threat, but as a solution. Every morning, he visited the same barber shop, the same diner, the same streets, and yet no one could say where he truly lived or who he truly worked for. His invisibility became legend. Men whispered that he had connections reaching from Pennsylvania to New York, to Detroit, even to Chicago. He never confirmed or denied it. When asked directly, he'd smile faintly and change the subject. His power was built not on secrets kept, but on mysteries left unanswered. He began forging alliances beyond state lines. The Megadino family of Buffalo trusted him implicitly, using him as a messenger, a middleman, a negotiator. He was too calm to provoke suspicion, too polite to appear threatening. He could walk into rooms where other men carried guns and leave with agreements sealed by nothing more than a handshake. In an age when mobsters made headlines for murder, Russell built his empire on civility. But even civility had its price. There were times when silence demanded blood, and he understood that too. When a small-time bootlegger in Pittston betrayed his crew and started dealing directly with the competition, the decision fell to Russell. He didn't shout, didn't make a spectacle. He simply met the man one evening, shared a cigarette, and told him the truth. You made a mistake that can't be fixed. The man was found 2 days later, his body buried beneath a rail line. No one spoke of it again. Justice, in Russell's world, wasn't revenge, it was maintenance. The machine had to keep running, clean and quiet. As the Great Depression deepened, legitimate business owners became desperate. Banks closed, factories shut down, and workers lined the streets begging for pay. Russell saw opportunity in the cracks of America's misery. He extended loans when no one else would, at interest rates that seemed kind, until they weren't. He helped local factories move shipments when their trucks broke down, only to later own the trucking routes himself. Step by step, The invisible hand of Russell Bufalino reached deeper into the economic heart of northeastern Pennsylvania. His influence was subtle but absolute. Politicians began to take his calls, priests blessed his charity donations, and police chiefs suddenly found themselves with better cars and quieter consciences. Russell never called it corruption. To him, it was equilibrium. In a world run by greed and desperation, he simply balanced the scales. One cold night, in the back room of a modest Italian restaurant, Russell attended a meeting that would change the shape of his power forever. Sitting around the table were men whose names would one day fill FBI files. Joseph Barbara of Endicott, Santo Trafficante from Florida, and Carlo Gambino from New York. They discussed routes, labor unions, and territories. But more importantly, they discussed trust. It wasn't the kind of trust you wrote down. It was the kind sealed by shared silence. Barbara had heard of Russell's calm efficiency and wanted him close. "You don't talk much," Barbara said that night, swirling his glass of wine. "That's what I like about you. Talking gets men killed." Russell smiled faintly. "Then we'll live a long time," he replied. And from that moment, he wasn't just another cog in the machine. He was part of the unseen architecture of American organized crime. Through the 1930s, as the world edged toward war, Russell's web grew denser. He quietly connected the garment industry in New York with trucking companies in Pennsylvania, ensuring that every shipment of cloth or leather moved under his eyes. He placed trusted men in local unions, not as leaders, but as listeners. Information flowed through them like water through pipes. By the time it reached him, it was clean, filtered, and priceless. He never called himself a boss, and few dared to label him one. The truth was, he didn't need the title. Power, he'd once said, was like smoke. It filled any room left unattended. His power spread that way, without shape or noise, until one day it was simply everywhere. But quiet power has a curse. It isolates. Russell began to live more cautiously, his world shrinking into deliberate routines. Every restaurant seat was chosen for its view of the door. Every conversation was layered with subtext. Friends became liabilities. Even allies were watched. His wife, Catherine, saw the change. She'd grown used to his absences, his long drives, his soft-spoken phone calls at odd hours. But she also saw the toll, the tightening of his shoulders, the longer pauses before he answered a simple question. She asked him once, "Do you ever get tired of watching everyone?" He looked at her, tired but calm, and said, "You only stop watching when it's too late." In public, he played the part of a gentleman, polite, well-dressed, generous to his community. He donated to churches, attended weddings, sent gifts to families of fallen miners. But beneath that civility, he was orchestrating something vast, a network of influence that reached into every layer of working-class life. Truck drivers, dock workers, and warehouse clerks all answered to someone who, in the end, answered to him. By the early 1940s, his connections reached into New York's 5 families, particularly the Genovese family. Russell became a trusted intermediary between regional families, a man whose word carried weight across borders. He didn't seek these roles. They found him. When conflicts arose, he was called to mediate. When disputes threatened to turn bloody, he was summoned to restore balance. It was said that he could sit between 2 men who wanted each other dead and leave them shaking hands before dessert. His influence extended into the Teamsters Union, though not directly. Not yet. He understood that labor was the future of control. Money could vanish, but labor kept the world moving. If you control the trucks, you control the goods. If you control the goods, you control the people. This philosophy became his silent creed, guiding his every move in the coming decades. But for now, in the stillness of post-oppression America, Russell remained shadow, a man who could stop violence with a whisper, who could make or break fortunes without leaving fingerprints. The FBI had begun taking notice, though they didn't yet understand what they were looking at. In reports, he appeared as a suspected associate, a name mentioned but never proven. Agents described him as quiet, polite, impossible to read. One even wrote, "Bufalino may be more important than he appears." They were right. As the 1940s deepened, World War II shifted the landscape of power once again. Many mobsters enlisted or used the war as cover for smuggling operations. Russell stayed home, running his network efficiently and quietly, using wartime shortages to expand into ration goods. He smuggled not only liquor, but machinery parts, oil, and textiles, anything scarce enough to profit from. The war made him richer, but it also made him indispensable to both criminals and businessmen alike. By the end of the war, he was no longer just a regional figure. He had quietly aligned himself with national powers like Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, yet maintained independence. He wasn't a soldier under any boss. He was a bridge between them. If the Mafia was a web, Russell was one of its anchor points, invisible yet vital. He never celebrated victories. To him, survival was the only success worth acknowledging. When the war ended, and the world erupted in noise and celebration, Russell sat alone in his office, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling. He didn't smile. Peace, to him, was only the space between storms. He knew what was coming next. The FBI's growing obsession with organized crime, the ambitious young gangsters who mistook headlines for power, the federal laws that would eventually turn whispers into indictments. But he wasn't afraid. He'd built his life on the one truth that outlasted every generation of mobsters. Those who make the most noise are the first to be silenced. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining like black glass. Russell stood at the window, watching his reflection blur against the city lights. The quiet boy from Monodoro had become the calm center of America's criminal storm. And yet, as he stared into the darkness, even he couldn't see how far his silence would reach, or how many would one day disappear beneath it. Because in the world Russell Bufalino was building, words were dangerous, but silence was power. And soon, even the most powerful men in America would learn that when the quiet dawn spoke, the entire underworld listened. Chapter 5. The Network Builder. The train from New York to Scranton cut through the winter fog like a blade, carrying more than passengers. It carried information, whispers, money, and the lifeblood of an empire being built in silence. Somewhere in one of its worn leather seats sat a man reading a newspaper he had no interest in. His hat brim shadowed his eyes. His suit was plain, his hands steady. No one gave him a second look, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Russell Bufalino had built his life on that kind of invisibility. He was the man who never seemed to be there, yet somehow his shadow stretched across states. The most powerful figures in organized crime already knew his name, but very few could claim to truly know him. By the late 1940s, the chaos of the Depression was gone, replaced by a new kind of America, optimistic, industrial, expanding fast. But beneath the post-war glow, another kind of expansion was happening. The Mafia, once a fractured set of immigrant gangs, was now a national institution, connected by invisible lines of money and loyalty that ran through cities like veins. Russell was one of the architects of that network. He didn't design it with blueprints or speeches. He built it with trust, silence, and time. He understood something that most gangsters never did. That power wasn't about being feared. It was about being needed. He didn't want to control everything. He wanted everyone to rely on him. If a man needed trucks, he called Russell. If he needed laborers for a factory, Russell had them. If he needed a problem solved quietly, Russell already knew about it before the question was asked. That was how you build a network, not by commanding men, but by making yourself indispensable. He had learned from watching the greats, Luciano, Costello, Genovese, Barbara, but his genius was restraint. While others sought control through violence or flash, he preferred patience. When men like Lucky Luciano rebuilt the Mafia into a corporation, Russell became one of the unseen administrators, ensuring that even the smallest gears turned smoothly. He didn't attend meetings unless necessary, didn't flaunt his wealth, and didn't tolerate those who confused noise for strength. His respect came not from his presence, but from his absence. When a deal went right, when two rival crews suddenly stopped fighting, when money arrived on time and no one got killed, men whispered, Bufalino handled it. The heart of his empire was not New York, but Pennsylvania, a place most mobsters treated like a flyover state. But Russell saw something different. It was the perfect midpoint between the chaos of New York and the order of the Midwest. The highways ran like arteries through its valleys, carrying coal, steel, textiles, and trucks filled with anything that could be bought or stolen. The towns were small enough to control, the cops cheap enough to buy, and the people respectful enough to stay quiet. It was the ideal place for a man like him, hidden but connected to everything. He built his base in Kingston, a quiet town near Pittston, surrounded by the Appalachian ridges. From a distance, it looked ordinary. Church bells, small shops, working men in dusty boots. But behind closed doors, deals were made that reached the top of the American underworld. Russell's modest home became an unofficial hub for major mob figures passing through the region. They didn't come for parties or parades. They came for his counsel. He was the man you called when tempers flare between families, when money went missing, when someone needed to disappear without questions. He had a reputation for fairness, for clarity, and for never letting ego poison business. Russell believed every man in the Mafia was like a thread in a vast tapestry. If one snapped, the rest unraveled. So he kept his threads strong by weaving them tightly together. He married alliances between New York families, connected Pennsylvania crews with Detroit and Chicago, and extended his reach into the labor unions that moved America's industry. Every relationship he formed served a purpose. Every favor was a seed that would one day bear fruit. He was, in every sense, a farmer of power, patient, methodical, and relentless in cultivation. One story from that era shows how he worked. A dispute had broken out between two trucking companies, one backed by the Megadino family in Buffalo, the other by a smaller outfit in Scranton. Threats were made, tires were slashed, and someone even tried to torch a warehouse. Instead of retaliation, both sides agreed to let Russell mediate. He met them in a diner off a quiet road, ordered coffee for everyone, and spoke for less than 5 minutes. He didn't yell, didn't argue, didn't even threaten. He simply reminded them that trucks could burn, but relationships couldn't be replaced. 2 weeks later, both companies were working together under a single contract. The profits doubled. No one ever forgot how he handled it. In the Mafia, such stories traveled faster than rumors of murder. Violence got you headlines. Wisdom got you longevity. Russell was no philosopher. He was pragmatic, but he understood human nature better than most. He knew men wanted to feel respected, even when they were being controlled. He made them believe they were choosing him, when in reality, they were already bound by his web of debts and gratitude. Every network has its heart, and for Russell, it was trust. He cultivated it the way others cultivated fear. When he vouched for a man, that man's value skyrocketed. When he withdrew his trust, it was a quiet death sentence. No one questioned it. His reputation for integrity was so unshakable that his word became its own currency. FBI files from the time would later note how Bufalino's influence cannot be measured by visible wealth or property ownership. They couldn't track what he owned, because what he owned wasn't material. It was human loyalty. He was building something far more durable than money. He was building a legacy. But even legacies need protection. And protection meant relationships with those in power, not just mob bosses, but politicians, union leaders, and law enforcement. Russell was smart enough to know that crime and politics were two sides of the same coin. Both depended on favors, secrets, and plausible deniability. He cultivated judges, mayors, and police chiefs not through bribes alone, but through generosity. He helped their campaigns, paid for their sons' weddings, contributed to church restorations, sent flowers when a loved one died. He made himself part of their personal lives. And in return, they turned a blind eye when trucks went missing, when certain names appeared on payrolls that didn't exist. He never flaunted these connections. He never spoke about them. But everyone understood. When a senator passed through town, He often stopped by Russell's favorite restaurant for dinner. When a federal agent transferred to Scranton, a friendly handshake from Russell's associate ensured he stayed focused on bigger targets. This wasn't corruption. It was equilibrium, the quiet balance between power and discretion. By the early 1950s, Russell's influence was everywhere and nowhere. The Bufalino name rarely appeared in newspapers, yet every important figure in the northeastern underworld owed him a favor. He was the connective tissue between families, Lucchese, Genovese, Megadino, and Detroit's Sicily clan. He kept peace between them when greed threatened to tear them apart. His home in Kingston became a kind of neutral ground, where disputes could be settled over coffee and cigarettes instead of bullets. He was not a man of passion. He was a man of principle. His rule was simple: make money, stay invisible, never embarrass the organization. He hated flamboyance, despised gossip, and had no tolerance for those who confused arrogance with strength. When one of his younger associates bought a flashy Cadillac and drove it through town, Russell said nothing. A week later, the car was gone. The message was clear: no one in his world was bigger than the organization. That philosophy was what made him indispensable to the Mafia Commission, the informal governing council that Luciano and Genovese had created to prevent internecine wars. Russell wasn't a founding member, but he became one of its quiet enforcers. When disputes arose between bosses, he was often the one sent to broker peace. He was small in stature, soft-spoken, and modest in appearance, but when he entered a room, men who commanded armies lowered their voices. He had one rule for himself: never let anger make the decision. Emotion, he believed, was the enemy of control. During one particularly tense meeting in the mid-50s, two bosses shouted threats across a table while bodyguards hovered near their guns. Russell waited until the noise died down. Then he leaned forward and said softly, "If either of you is dead tomorrow, the FBI wins. If you both live, we all eat." Silence followed. The argument ended. The room belonged to him. The FBI began to take real notice then. Agents tracked his movements, noted his connections, even tapped phones of his known associates. Yet they found nothing concrete. He spoke rarely on the phone, and when he did, it was about weather, church, or family. They couldn't understand how such a small man from Pennsylvania held such vast power without leaving fingerprints. In a memo dated 1954, one frustrated agent wrote, "Bufalino may be the most important figure in Pennsylvania, but we have no way to prove it. The man's a ghost." Russell wore that reputation like armor. Being underestimated was his favorite disguise. He let the loud ones attract attention, guys like Carlo Gambino or Vito Genovese, while he quietly controlled the arteries that fed their empires. In meetings, he was deferential, polite, but behind the scenes, he was often the one who decided who lived, who worked, and who prospered. Yet power didn't change him. He still lived modestly, still walked to church on Sundays, still sat on his porch reading the paper like any other retiree. To the townspeople, he was just Mr. Bufalino, a quiet man who tipped well and minded his business. Only a handful knew that his phone calls reached Havana, Detroit, and Chicago, that his word could move millions or stop wars. There was something almost spiritual about the way he approached power. To him, it wasn't glory, it was stewardship, a responsibility to keep the system running, to protect the structure from greed and stupidity. In private moments, when speaking to his closest allies, he would warn them about the dangers of visibility. "A lion doesn't need to roar," he once said. "He just needs to be known." But the world around him was changing. A new generation of mobsters was rising, men hungry for attention, impatient for power. They didn't understand the old ways of omerta, the sacred silence that had protected the organization for decades. They saw newspapers as trophies, not threats. Russell watched this new breed with a mixture of curiosity and disappointment. He knew their noise would destroy what he'd spent a lifetime building. And soon, that noise would draw the attention of the government, the media, and a new kind of enemy, one that couldn't be silenced with bullets. For now, though, in the quiet towns of Pennsylvania, The world was still his. The roads, the unions, the warehouses, all connected by invisible lines of loyalty. Every whisper passed through him. Every secret crossed his desk. He didn't need to look over his shoulder. The network he built protected him, shielded him, fed him. It was the perfect empire, not marked on any map, not written in any ledger, but alive in the hearts of men who owed him everything. And as the evening train roared past Kingston, its windows flickering with light, Russell stood by his window, watching it fade into the darkness. He knew the peace wouldn't last forever. It never did. But as long as he could keep the lines connected, as long as he could keep the world believing he was just another quiet man in a small town, the empire would endure. For Russell Bufalino, silence wasn't just survival, it was art. And in that silence, he had built something no bullet could destroy. But history has a way of testing even the quietest kings, and somewhere beyond the ridges, that test was already on its way, disguised as friendship, ambition, and a name that would one day haunt him: Jimmy Hoffa. Chapter 6. The Mafia's Hidden Council. The room was small, smoke-thick, and silent. The kind of silence that had weight to it. A single bulb swung overhead, flickering just enough to make the faces around the table look carved from stone. Men of immense power sat shoulder to shoulder, but no one spoke until one man did. He was neither the richest nor the most feared, yet when Russell Bufalino began to talk, the noise in their heads seemed to stop. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't come from volume. It came from control. And on that night, in the early 1950s, it became clear to everyone present that Bufalino wasn't just another regional figure. He was one of the few who understood that the American Mafia wasn't just a network of criminals anymore. It was a government, unofficial, invisible, but more efficient than the one in Washington. To understand how he reached that table, you have to go back to the aftermath of the Prohibition era, when the streets had quieted but the power had concentrated. Men like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky had turned organized crime into a national business, creating what they called the Commission, a council of bosses from every major family designed to prevent the wars that once bled the cities dry. It was the Mafia's hidden parliament, its Senate of shadows. For years, only the most visible bosses were known to have influence there. But in time, as the need for discretion grew, the real power began shifting toward men like Russell Bufalino, those who didn't crave attention, who ruled from behind the curtain rather than upon the stage. Russell's rise into that inner circle didn't happen with a gun or a headline. It happened with consistency. The Commission valued men who could be trusted not to bring the spotlight onto the organization. And no one was more invisible, more efficient, or more quietly respected than the small, soft-spoken man from Pennsylvania. When tempers flared between families, Russell was often the one flown in to calm the waters. When someone needed to disappear quietly, he was consulted, not because he was ruthless, but because he was clean. He understood balance. He understood when to let blood flow and when to let pride fade. The other bosses noticed. He was not like the flamboyant dons of New York who wore silk suits and smiled for photographers. He wore plain gray, lived modestly, and never made promises he couldn't keep. His life was a contradiction. He could sit in a diner eating soup next to laborers who didn't know his name, then walk into a closed meeting with men whose reach spanned continents. It was his invisibility that made him indispensable. To outsiders, he was nobody. To insiders, he was the quiet equilibrium holding everything together. The Mafia of the 1950s was an empire divided into territories. New York's 5 families, the Chicago outfit, Detroit's partnership, and dozens of smaller but essential satellites. Each had its strengths, its secrets, and its ambitions. What kept them from devouring each other was the Commission, a delicate system of respect, negotiation, and fear. Russell became one of its key diplomats. He had no official title, but when a family from Philadelphia clashed with one from Buffalo over union contracts, they both deferred to him. His judgment was final because it was fair. He didn't favor one side or another. He favored order. Meetings were held in hotel suites, country estates, even fishing cabins. Russell attended many of them, always quiet, always composed, his small frame and calm eyes making him look more like an accountant than a criminal statesman. He'd sit through hours of shouting, listening to accusations, to boasts, to threats, and when the room had exhausted itself, he'd lean forward, speak a few words, and bring everyone back to reason. It wasn't magic. It was mastery of timing. He knew that men who ruled with fear eventually drowned in it. The ones who ruled with patience could control those fears without firing a shot. His connection to Joseph Barbara, the powerful mobster from Endicott, was crucial in cementing his place within the council. Barbara trusted him completely, often using his home as a meeting point for the nation's most powerful bosses. Russell coordinated many of these gatherings, managing who sat where, who spoke first, who didn't get invited at all. It was a kind of choreography, dangerous, precise, and essential. The wrong mix of egos could lead to disaster, but under Bufalino's guidance, meetings ended in handshakes instead of headlines. The American Mafia in those years was at its peak, rich, disciplined, and largely invisible. Money flowed from unions, casinos, shipping docks, construction sites, and the growing black markets in narcotics and gambling. The bosses were no longer street thugs. They were CEOs. They had lawyers, accountants, politicians, and judges on retainer. And Russell understood better than anyone that for an empire built on a legality to survive, it had to mimic the stability of the legitimate world. His greatest strength was making the illegal look respectable. He moved carefully, never too fast, never too ambitious. When the Genovese family sought to expand their influence into the labor unions of Pennsylvania, Russell facilitated the transition quietly, ensuring the local crews felt respected rather than replaced. He brokered a compromise that allowed everyone to profit and no one to lose face. It was his gift, the ability to turn rivalries into partnerships. But even in the world of order, cracks began to appear. Vito Genovese, a man with ambition that rivaled his paranoia, was beginning to challenge the established hierarchy. He saw himself as the true ruler of the American Mafia, and he distrusted anyone who could think independently. Russell recognized the danger early. He knew Genovese's hunger for power could undo the stability men like Luciano and Costello had spent years building. Yet he also knew that open opposition was suicide. So he did what he always did. He stayed neutral, a ghost between warring titans. Behind the scenes, Russell's influence expanded into the unions, especially the Teamsters, whose leader, Jimmy Hoffa, was becoming a household name. Hoffa's rise was spectacular, his power immense. But he needed connections, to money, to muscle, to men who could make problems vanish. Russell provided all of that. Their friendship began as business, but it would grow into something far more complicated, far more dangerous. For now, though, Hoffa was just one piece on the board, a piece that Russell positioned carefully. The FBI, by the mid-50s, had begun to take a serious interest in the mafia structure, but they were working blind. Edgar Hoover still denied the existence of organized crime at the national level. And even when evidence surfaced, Russell's name appeared only in passing, never as a suspect, only as an associate of others. The agents who did cross paths with him often dismissed him as unremarkable. He didn't fit the stereotype. No loud cars, no gambling dens, no obvious vice. Just a quiet, polite man who never seemed to be home when they came knocking. That was how he liked it. The less they saw, the less they could imagine. Within the hidden council of the Mafia, Russell's word carried the weight of law. Yet, he never ruled by decree. He preferred persuasion, logic, and timing. During one meeting, when two families argued over casino profits, the tension nearly erupted into violence. Russell interrupted gently. "You're arguing over dollars," he said. "But if you keep arguing, you'll lose millions. If we bleed each other, the feds don't have to lift a finger." The room went still. He was right, and they knew it. That was his weapon, clarity. He made even the angriest men realize how much they stood to lose. He didn't just build connections among mobsters. He built them across industries. His reach extended into trucking, construction, textile manufacturing, and even entertainment. If a contract was awarded in Pennsylvania or New York that involved unions, there was a good chance Russell's fingerprints were somewhere in the paperwork, though invisible to anyone looking. He had learned from Luciano and Lansky that the future of organized crime wasn't violence. It was business. And the best businessmen were the ones who didn't need to sign their names. Still, power like his could never remain completely hidden. The whispers about him grew. FBI memos began to mention a shadow network centered around northeastern Pennsylvania. Reporters chasing rumors of a mafia commission occasionally caught his name, but there was never enough to print. To them, Russell was a ghost story told in police bars, a man who appeared at meetings that didn't exist, who gave orders no one heard, whose empire left no trace. The truth was both simpler and more dangerous. Bufalino wasn't chasing power for himself. He was protecting a system, a delicate ecosystem of trust and silence that had taken decades to build. He knew that if the mafia became too public, too proud, it would destroy itself. And so he devoted his life to maintaining balance. He called it respect. Others called it fear. But either way, it kept the peace. In 1957, that peace would be tested like never before. Joseph Barbara, Russell's close ally, decided to host a national meeting of bosses at his home in Appalachian, New York. It was meant to be a routine gathering, a check-in, a chance to reaffirm alliances, to discuss profits and territories. Russell helped coordinate it, as always, ensuring that invitations reached only the right men. But fate had other plans. That meeting would explode into infamy, exposing the existence of the mafia to the entire world. The Appalachian Summit would shatter the illusion of invisibility forever. But on the eve of that disaster, Russell sat in his Kingston home, calm as ever, sipping tea while his phone rang quietly in the background. The underworld was humming with anticipation. Bosses were traveling in from all directions. It was supposed to be another quiet gathering, another test of diplomacy. He couldn't have known that within hours, that calm would break, and the American Mafia's hidden counsel, the one he had helped nurture for years, would be dragged screaming into the light. For decades, Russell Bufalino had operated like a ghost, moving unseen, controlling without touching, ruling without ruling. But history has a cruel sense of timing. The man who built the network to keep the mafia hidden was about to witness its greatest exposure. And as cars began to roll toward that small town in upstate New York, the quiet dawn of Pennsylvania sat in silence, unaware that the world was about to know his name. Chapter 7. The Appalachian Summit, 1957. The cold November wind rolled through the quiet hills of upstate New York, carrying the scent of wet leaves and wood smoke. On the surface, it was just another small-town morning. Birds perched on telephone wires, neighbors raked their yards, and the town of Appalachian, barely a dot on the map, seemed as ordinary as ever. But behind one modest country home, dozens of expensive cars were parked in neat rows, their chrome glinting under the pale sunlight. Black Cadillacs, Buicks, Lincolns, all freshly washed, all out of place. Inside that home, the most powerful men in organized crime were gathering for what would be remembered as the single biggest mistake in mafia history. And among them, quietly managing the logistics with the calm of a man watering his garden, was Russell Bufalino. He hadn't wanted the meeting. In fact, he'd warned Joseph Barbara, the host, and his close ally, that bringing so many bosses together in one place was asking for trouble. But Barbara insisted. He wanted to show strength, to host what he called a friendly get-together. In the mafia world, friendship could mean business. It could also mean war. Russell, ever the realist, knew the risk. Yet, out of loyalty, and perhaps a sense of duty to maintain the fragile balance among families, he agreed to help organize it. His job was simple: coordinate arrivals, ensure security, and make sure no one outside their circle knew it was happening. For years, he'd orchestrated similar meetings without a single problem. But this time, fate would betray him. The morning of November 14th, 1957, began quietly. One by one, black cars arrived at Barbara's estate on McFall Road. Men stepped out, adjusting their coats, greeting each other with soft embraces and murmured Italian. These were not thugs or street criminals. They were businessmen, at least in appearance. Carlo Gambino, Vito Genovese, Joe Prophesy, Sano Trafficani, and dozens of others had come from across the country. They represented the hidden government of organized crime, an empire of unions, rackets, casinos, and industries stretching from New York to Havana. They came to discuss peace, profit, and the division of power. Some said it was a chance to congratulate Genovese on consolidating his influence. Others believed it was about narcotics routes or Cuba's booming casinos. Whatever the true reason, every man there understood the importance of discretion. Russell, standing near the driveway, oversaw the arrivals like a conductor, ensuring his orchestra was in tune. He noted every license plate, every handshake. His eyes missed nothing. He was calm, precise, even polite. But inside, something gnawed at him. Too many cars, too many faces, too much noise. He knew the town couldn't handle this kind of attention. He'd grown up in silence, built his life on invisibility, and here they were, an army of criminals parked in the middle of nowhere like tourists. He told Barbara again, "This looks bad." Barbara just waved him off with a smile. "Relax, Russell. The cops around here don't know who we are." He wasn't wrong about the cops not knowing, but he underestimated one man, a sharp-eyed New York State trooper named Edgar Croswell. Croswell had noticed the influx of fancy cars into the small town. Their drivers, dressed too well for the countryside, aroused his suspicion. When he saw a butcher's delivery truck bringing more meat than a normal household could eat in a week, his instincts told him something was off. While Russell and Barbara believed they were hosting a private gathering, Croswell was quietly organizing a raid that would become legendary. Inside the house, the meeting began as any other. The air was thick with cigar smoke and whispered conversation. Men discussed territory disputes, labor rackets, and the growing concern over narcotics trafficking. Some spoke of Cuba, others of the Teamsters, and many simply wanted to reaffirm alliances after years of tension. It was supposed to be peaceful, a show of unity after decades of bloodshed. But unity was fragile. Power was shifting, and everyone knew it. Vito Genovese sat at the table, his eyes gleaming with ambition, already seeing himself as the new king of the Mafia. Russell watched him carefully. He didn't trust him. Genovese's kind of hunger was dangerous. It broke the balance that men like Bufalino had spent their lives maintaining. Halfway through the discussions, Russell stepped outside for air. He had always trusted his instincts, and now they screamed that something was wrong. The silence of the countryside was different, too tense, too quiet. He looked toward the edge of the property and saw a car parked on the road, a man inside with binoculars. His stomach sank. He walked back inside and whispered to Barbara, "We have company." Barbara froze, then turned pale. Seconds later, the sound of police sirens cut through the air. Panic erupted. Men scrambled, shouting in English, Italian, and curses. Expensive suits tore as bosses ran through the backyard, leaping fences and disappearing into the woods. Some ditched their cars, others dove into the bushes. The scene looked almost comical, a parade of the underworld's most powerful men fleeing through muddy fields like startled deer. But to Russell, it was a nightmare. Everything he'd spent his life building, secrecy, structure, discipline, was unraveling in the chaos. He moved quickly, methodically. While others ran blindly, Russell made his way through the back of the property, avoiding the main road. He knew every path in those woods, every creek and clearing. Years of caution had trained him for moments like this. He reached his car parked down the hill, wiped his shoes, and drove off calmly, merging with local traffic before anyone could stop him. When the police surrounded Barbara's house minutes later, the meeting had dissolved into confusion. Some men were caught on site, others miles away. Dozens were arrested, their names recorded by stunned officers who had no idea they were writing history. The Appalachian raid shattered the Mafia's invisibility. Newspapers around the world printed headlines about a national crime syndicate exposed in a small New York town. For decades, law enforcement had been denied proof of organized crime's unity. Now they had photographs, dozens of men in suits being marched into custody, their faces unmistakable. The myth of secrecy was gone. J. Edgar Hoover, who had once publicly dismissed the idea of a mafia, was forced to acknowledge its existence. The FBI launched a full-scale campaign against organized crime, and every man at that meeting found himself under new scrutiny. For Russell, it was a bitter lesson. He'd always believed that noise brought death, and now the loudest noise imaginable had found them all. His name appeared briefly in reports, but his quick escape spared him arrest. To investigators, he remained a secondary figure, a background player. But within the mafia, his reputation changed overnight. He was the man who had seen disaster coming and slipped away untouched. That escape wasn't luck. It was instinct, born from decades of surviving by silence. In the months that followed, the fallout was devastating. Joseph Barbara's health collapsed under pressure. Dozens of mobsters were indicted or deported. The commission itself was shaken to its core. Families that once trusted one another now viewed every meeting as a potential trap. The FBI planted informants, tapped phones, infiltrated unions. The invisible government Russell had helped build was now under siege. Yet, while others panicked, he adapted. He didn't fight the new reality. He molded it. He stopped attending large gatherings, stopped traveling unnecessarily, and communicated only through trusted intermediaries. He scaled his empire inward, focusing on smaller, tighter circles of loyalty. While New York bosses scrambled to repair their images, Bufalino doubled down on invisibility. If the government wanted to find the mafia, they would have to find him first. And that, he knew, was impossible. Behind closed doors, he counseled others to do the same. The age of kings is over, he told one younger associate. Now we survive by being ghosts. He began cultivating a new generation of lieutenants, quiet, educated men who understood business better than bloodshed. He pushed deeper into legitimate industries, garment trucking, waste management, cigarette distribution, and the unions that kept them moving. His genius wasn't in crime itself. It was in making crime blend so perfectly into the fabric of society that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The FBI didn't forget Appalachian. They used it as a rallying cry, a justification to dismantle every network they could find. Wiretaps multiplied. Surveillance teams followed known associates. Names once whispered only in back rooms became public record. But through all of it, Russell's presence remained elusive. They knew he existed. They just couldn't prove anything. Agents who tailed him described him as polite, cautious, boring even. He held the door open for strangers, paid his bills on time, attended church regularly. To them, he looked like a model citizen. Only those inside his circle knew that every small, polite gesture masked a mind still orchestrating the balance of an empire. Appalachian had taught him that no system was invincible, not even one built on silence. But it also proved something else, that silence could outlast exposure. The loudest men had been caught, the quietest had escaped. That became his creed moving forward. He abandoned grand gestures and relied on whispers, signals, and meetings that never left paper trails. Even his closest allies never fully knew his schedule. Still, something inside him changed after that day. For the first time, he saw fear, not for himself, but for the organization. He saw how one careless act, one ego-driven decision, could end decades of structure. The mafia wasn't just under attack. It was vulnerable from within. He vowed never to let that happen again. From that moment, Russell Bufalino didn't just serve the system. He became its protector. Years later, when asked by an associate why the Appalachian meeting had gone so wrong, Russell gave a small, tired smile. Because too many men wanted to be seen, he said softly. And men who want to be seen always end up in the light. He never spoke of that day again. But those who knew him said he grew quieter afterward, more cautious, more distant. He began pulling the strings of power from deeper shadows, no longer content to be a diplomat. Now he was a guardian, ensuring that no one ever repeated Joseph Barber's mistake. The Appalachian Summit would go down as the Mafia's greatest humiliation, a day when its secret council was dragged out of the dark and into history's gaze. But for Russell Bufalino, it was something else entirely. It was the day he became irreplaceable. Because in a world that had just been exposed, only one kind of man could survive. The man no one could see. And in the years to come, as the government's war on organized crime intensified, that invisibility would become his greatest weapon and his curse. Chapter 8. After Appalachian, the man who survived. The smoke from the wreckage of Appalachian lingered for years. It wasn't the kind of smoke you could see. It was the kind that sank into the walls of every safe house, every whispered conversation, every sleepless night in the Mafia's hidden world. The summit had been meant to unify the families, to remind everyone that the old ways still held power. Instead, it exposed them all to the blinding light of the public eye. Headlines screamed of crime lords and national syndicates. Photographs of men in fine suits being herded by police flashed across newspapers from New York to Los Angeles. It was humiliation on a national scale, and the underworld trembled beneath it. Many of the men who had strutted proudly through Barbara's estate that morning were now fugitives, arrested, or under constant watch. But Russell Bufalino, calm, invisible, unreadable, had walked away untouched. He'd been there. He'd seen it happen. But he'd vanished before the sirens arrived, disappearing into the folds of Pennsylvania's quiet hills like a ghost. The FBI called it luck. Those who knew him called it instinct. Russell didn't run because he was afraid. He left because he understood how quickly pride could turn to exposure. When the others laughed over cigars, he'd already sensed something wrong in the air. That intuition saved him. It also set him apart. After Appalachian, men began to look at him differently, not just as a mediator or a quiet power broker, but as a survivor, the kind of man who always saw the blade before it fell. The aftermath was chaos. The FBI launched investigations into everyone who had attended. Phone lines were tapped, businesses raided, informants paid. The Mafia, once confident in its invisibility, now scrambled to erase itself from the headlines. Bosses met in secrecy, paranoid and angry. The commission, that delicate system of balance Russell had spent years helping maintain, fractured under the pressure. Everyone was looking for someone to blame, someone to trust, someone who still knew how to operate when the world was watching. They found him in the man who said the least. Russell became the quiet center of the storm. While others panicked, he remained steady. He didn't call meetings. He didn't make speeches. He simply went about his business, as though nothing had changed. That calmness drew others to him. Old friends and new faces began reaching out, not through public gatherings, but through private visits, quiet drives, and coded messages. They wanted guidance. They wanted stability. Russell gave it to them. He wasn't trying to lead. He was trying to preserve. The Mafia's strength had always been its silence, and he was determined to bring that silence back. For months after the raid, the FBI watched his every move. They followed him to diners, to church, to family gatherings. They noted his routine: early mornings, small meetings, careful conversations. They recorded the plates of cars that visited his modest home in Kingston. But no matter how closely they looked, they found nothing illegal. He didn't carry weapons. He didn't attend obvious gatherings. He didn't flash wealth or influence. To them, he was frustratingly ordinary. But within that ordinariness was genius. Russell had mastered the art of blending in, not by pretending to be someone else, but by being completely unremarkable. He gave them nothing. Meanwhile, the world around him was changing. The 1950s were ending, and a new America was rising, one obsessed with progress, prosperity, and surveillance. The FBI grew stronger. Federal wiretap laws expanded. Television brought crime into living rooms across the country. The mob could no longer hide in the same shadows. But Russell was already adjusting. He turned away from open dealings, and doubled down on relationships that didn't need words. If he wanted something done, he didn't call. He sent a man who'd worked for him for 20 years. If money needed to move, it moved through layers so thick that even the most determined agent couldn't trace it. He didn't need to shout orders. He simply whispered ideas, and the machine moved itself. His greatest strength wasn't his ability to intimidate. It was his ability to anticipate. He saw how the mob's survival would depend on subtlety, not spectacle. While New York bosses battled for dominance, Genovese consolidating his empire, Gambino quietly maneuvering for control, Russell fortified the infrastructure beneath them all. He expanded his influence into the labor unions, trucking companies, and warehouses that powered America's post-war boom. He wasn't interested in casinos or flashy rackets. He was interested in systems. He wanted to control the arteries through which the country's goods flowed. If he could control the movement of products, he could control the flow of money. And if he could control money, he could control everyone who needed it. In Pennsylvania, his reach became absolute. No major deal, no contract, no shipment passed through the region without his knowledge. But his control was never heavy-handed. He preferred persuasion over punishment. A conversation in a car, a visit to a man's home, a simple phrase, "You're making too much noise." Those words carried more weight than any threat. People feared him not because he was violent, but because they knew he saw everything. He had an uncanny ability to make men confess things without realizing they were confessing. He'd sit across from them, eyes calm, fingers gently tapping the table, and ask a single question. The silence that followed was often enough to break them. He still met occasionally with Joseph Barbara, though their relationship had changed. Barbara's health was failing, and his power was gone. The once proud host of the Appalachian meeting now lived in isolation, haunted by the fallout. Russell visited him out of loyalty, but also as a warning to himself. Pride, he'd realized, was the poison that destroyed men like Barbara. Pride had made him invite too many guests, too many cars, too much attention. Pride had ended the age of invincibility. Russell vowed never to let it end him. He turned his focus to rebuilding the lines of communication between families, but in new ways. The old councils were gone, replaced by discreet, one-on-one meetings in hotel lobbies, back rooms, and quiet countryside retreats. He became the messenger again, carrying information between bosses who couldn't risk being seen together. It was dangerous work, but he thrived on it. He was the only man everyone trusted. Even men who hated each other would speak to him. They knew he wouldn't twist words or take sides. He wasn't there to win. He was there to balance. That balance extended beyond the mafia itself. Russell began weaving connections between legitimate businessmen, union leaders, and political figures. He understood that survival meant integration. The mob couldn't exist as an isolated underworld anymore. It had to blend into the fabric of American power. Through intermediaries, he made donations to local politicians, invested in construction projects, and ensured that certain factories stayed open just long enough to keep the unions happy. To outsiders, he was a successful businessman with a network of loyal friends. To those in the know, he was the glue holding the invisible empire together. Even his rivals respected him. Carlo Gambino, now one of the most powerful bosses in New York, admired his discipline. While others flaunted their fortunes, Russell remained humble. He lived in the same modest house, drove the same car, attended the same church. He believed consistency was camouflage. His wife, Catherine, often worried about how much he carried in silence, but he always reassured her the same way, with a faint smile and a simple truth. The less they know, the safer we are. Still, the ghosts of Appalachian followed him. Every few months, he'd receive a summons or a subpoena, forcing him to testify before grand juries or answer vague questions about his business associations. He'd sit calmly under the harsh lights, hands folded neatly, and respond with the same steady rhythm. "I don't recall. I don't know that man. I wasn't there." No matter how many times they tried, no one could make him break. His composure drove prosecutors mad. Behind closed doors, Agents joked that trying to interrogate Bufalino was like trying to interrogate fog. The world around him grew louder. The 60s were coming, and with them came a new kind of chaos: civil rights protests, political assassinations, and wars overseas. The country was restless, and in that restlessness, new opportunities emerged. Russell saw that chaos not as danger, but as cover. The more the government focused on larger crises, the less they focused on him. He expanded quietly, investing through trusted frontmen in new businesses: garment trucking in New York, cigarette distribution in New Jersey, even small interests in Vegas casinos through intermediaries. Nothing traced back to him directly. He'd mastered the art of existing without evidence. But the changes in the world weren't limited to politics. Inside the Mafia, a generational shift was happening. Younger gangsters, raised on television and wealth, didn't respect the old codes. They wanted recognition, not discretion. They wanted to be seen, to be remembered. Russell saw it everywhere: the arrogance, the impatience, the greed. It disgusted him. He'd spent a lifetime proving that real power came from being unseen. Yet these new men craved cameras and headlines. It was a disease, and he knew it would kill them. When one of his younger associates started bragging about connections to New York bosses, Russell called him in for a quiet talk. They sat in a dimly lit office, the hum of a refrigerator the only sound. Russell leaned back in his chair and asked, "Do you know why people respect me?" The man hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Because no one ever sees me coming," Russell said. "And when they do, it's already too late." The next day, the associate packed his bags and left town. He never spoke publicly again. By the early 1960s, Russell's legend was cemented. The older generation saw him as the last of the true old-world dons, a man who ruled with silence, not fear. The younger generation saw him as a ghost, a relic from a time when loyalty still meant something. Yet even as the Mafia began to splinter, he remained untouched. The FBI couldn't catch him, rivals couldn't outmaneuver him, and even time seemed reluctant to challenge him. He was a survivor in a world built to destroy its own. In private moments, though, even he felt the weight of it, the solitude, the endless vigilance. He knew he couldn't afford to relax, not for a second. Every handshake, every favor, every glance in a mirror carried the question of whether he'd misjudged someone, trusted too easily, stayed too long. But when doubt crept in, he pushed it away. Fear, he believed, was just another way of being seen. The Mafia would never be the same after Appalachian. It had lost its invisibility, its mystique, its illusion of control. But men like Russell Bufalino proved that silence still worked, that invisibility could still be armor. While others fell to greed, publicity, or betrayal, he endured, guiding the remnants of a fractured empire with the same steady hand that had carried him from the dusty streets of Montedoro to the smoke-filled rooms of power. History would forget many of the loud ones. Their names would fade, their stories buried under their own noise. But not him. He would remain in the margins, in the quiet corners of reports and the shadows of testimonies. A figure so silent, so measured, that even those who hunted him began to admire him. Russell Bufalino didn't just survive Appalachian. He outlasted it. And as the years rolled forward, the underworld he helped rebuild would once again look to him, not as the man who made history, but as the man who avoided it. Because in the world he ruled, surviving wasn't about winning. It was about never being seen losing at all. Chapter 9. The Hoffa Connection. The first time Russell Bufalino met Jimmy Hoffa, it wasn't in a smoky backroom or a lavish casino. It was in a modest restaurant off a Michigan highway, the kind of place with sticky counters and coffee that never tasted right. Hoffa walked in like a man already halfway through a deal, brisk, confident, impatient. Russell was already seated, small and quiet, the very picture of calm. The two men couldn't have been more different. Hoffa was all energy, a thunderstorm in a suit. Bufalino was still water, deep and cold. But as they spoke, it became clear that they were reflections of the same thing: ambition wrapped in discipline. That meeting, quiet and unrecorded, would mark the beginning of one of the most powerful alliances in the history of American organized crime. By the time they met in the early 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa was already a legend in the making. As the head of the Teamsters Union, he commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of workers who controlled the veins of American commerce. Truckers, warehousemen, factory drivers, the men who moved the country's goods, all answered to Hoffa. But for all his charisma, for all his fiery speeches about labor and fairness, Hoffa knew one thing: power cost money, and money didn't always come clean. He needed allies who could move cash, silence rivals, and enforce loyalty when persuasion failed. The Mafia needed access to the Teamsters' pension funds, an ocean of untapped wealth that could finance everything from Las Vegas casinos to construction empires. It was a match made not in friendship, but in mutual necessity. Russell saw it immediately. Hoffa had what the mob needed: legitimacy. Hoffa saw what Russell offered: protection, access, and quiet efficiency. Their connection wasn't about greed, it was about balance. Hoffa was the public face of a movement. Russell was its shadow. Where Hoffa shouted into microphones, Russell whispered into ears. They moved in different worlds, but shared one unspoken rule: control must always look like service. Russell became Hoffa's counselor, confidant, and fixer. When deals with contractors stalled, Russell smoothed them over. When local union heads threatened rebellion, he arranged quiet sit-downs that ended in handshakes or silence. He taught Hoffa how to navigate the old-world codes of the Mafia without losing his grip on the new-world politics of labor. Hoffa, in turn, introduced Russell to men who ran factories, ports, and trucking routes. They built an invisible bridge between two of the most powerful networks in America: labor and organized crime. In those years, the Teamsters Pension Fund became a goldmine. On paper, it was meant to secure the futures of hardworking men. In reality, it became the financial backbone of mob investments across the country. Casinos in Las Vegas, hotels in Miami, construction projects in Chicago, all of them grew from loans approved by Hoffa's people and guaranteed by men like Russell. The money flowed quietly, profitably, and legally enough to fool the system. The line between business and crime blurred until it was no longer visible. The friendship between Hoffa and Bufalino was genuine, but it was built on caution. Russell liked Hoffa's drive, but distrusted his mouth. Hoffa liked Russell's loyalty, but feared his stillness. They needed each other, but never forgot the risk. At dinners, they'd talk for hours about union politics, family, the future of organized labor, but the air between them always carried tension. Hoffa's voice would rise, full of fire and conviction, while Russell would simply listen, his expression unreadable. When Hoffa was done, Russell would take a long drag from a cigarette and say something short and measured like, "That'll work, but make it quieter." Hoffa would grumble, but he'd follow the advice every time. Their alliance strengthened through the 1950s. Russell became Hoffa's gateway to the most powerful mafia families in America. When Hoffa needed muscle, Russell arranged it. When he needed introductions, Russell made them. The Teamsters became not just a union, but an empire, one protected by men who didn't show up in the union's ledgers. For the first time, the Mafia didn't just influence labor, it owned part of it. The country had no idea how much of its infrastructure was now controlled by men who never stepped into the light. But the light was coming. Robert F. Kennedy, young, ambitious, and relentless, had made it his mission to bring down Hoffa. To Kennedy, the Teamsters were a symbol of everything corrupt about American labor: the greed, the violence, the unseen hands pulling strings from behind the curtain. Hoffa became his obsession, and when Kennedy looked at Hoffa, he saw the shadows behind him. Russell's name appeared in those shadows again and again, whispered by informants and printed in reports that never reached proof. Kennedy didn't know exactly who Bufalino was, but he understood that he was dangerous, a man who seemed to exist only in other men's stories. The hearings began in the late 1950s. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, and Hoffa, unshaken, sat before the Senate committee like a boxer in the ring. He denied everything, smiled through insults, and fired back with his own. America loved it. Kennedy hated it. And while Hoffa made headlines, Russell stayed in the background, advising quietly, never showing his face in the public arena. He didn't need to defend himself. He simply didn't exist. To the FBI, it was infuriating. They knew his influence stretched far beyond Pennsylvania. They knew he sat at the center of the web connecting unions, rackets, and legitimate industries. But every time they reached for him, he was already gone. Behind the scenes, Russell was tightening his grip. He understood that Hoffa's rise to power made him a target not just for the government, but for the mob itself. Power that loud was dangerous. The Mafia thrived on invisibility, and Hoffa was anything but invisible. Russell warned him repeatedly. "You're becoming the story," he told him one night. "That's not where you want to be." Hoffa laughed it off. He believed his popularity made him untouchable. But Russell knew better. The higher a man climbed, the more the air thinned. Still, their friendship endured. Russell admired Hoffa's courage, even if he thought it reckless. Hoffa admired Russell's calm, even if he found it maddening. Together, they formed a kind of paradox: the loud reformer and the silent tactician, the public crusader and the invisible godfather. For a while, their balance worked perfectly. The Union grew stronger, richer, more feared. Politicians wanted Hoffa's endorsement. Businessmen wanted his loans. And through it all, Russell ensured that the money flowed both ways. Then came 1967. Hoffa was convicted of bribery and jury tampering. The man who had once ruled America's largest union was sentenced to 13 years in prison. To most, it looked like the end. To Russell, it was just another shift in the weather. He kept the networks alive, made sure Hoffa's family was taken care of, and maintained control of the union's most valuable assets. When Hoffa was sent away, Russell stepped into the quiet vacuum he left behind. He didn't take his throne. He preserved it. Inside prison, Hoffa stewed. The world was changing fast. The new leadership of the Teamsters, now under Frank Fitzsimmons, was more compliant, more willing to play by the Mafia's rules. Russell liked Fitzsimmons. He was predictable, easy to manage. Hoffa, on the other hand, burned with resentment. He wrote letters, made promises, plotted his return. He couldn't stand watching others control what he'd built. And every time he spoke of coming back, Russell listened carefully, his calm voice reminding him to be patient. "The world moves on, Jimmy," he'd say. "Sometimes the best way to win is to stop fighting." But Hoffa wasn't made for silence. When Hoffa was finally released from prison in the early 1970s, he returned to a world he no longer recognized. The Mafia had changed. The old guard, men like Russell, still valued loyalty and structure. But the new generation saw Hoffa as a problem, a loud relic from another time. He wanted his union back, and they wanted him gone. Russell stood in the middle, trying to mediate. He'd known Hoffa for over 20 years. He didn't want to see him destroyed, but he also couldn't protect him forever. Hoffa's return threatened the fragile order Russell had worked so hard to maintain. Their friendship began to strain. Hoffa didn't trust the new leadership. He didn't trust the mob. He began making calls, reaching out to anyone who would listen. He believed that his loyalty to men like Bufalino meant they would stand by him. What he didn't understand was that loyalty had limits when survival was at stake. Russell tried to calm him, inviting him to quiet meetings, urging him to step back, to retire gracefully. But Hoffa refused. "I'm not done," he told him. "They owe me." The tension reached a breaking point in the summer of 1975. Hoffa was restless, angry, and desperate to reclaim control of the Teamsters. He planned a meeting with two Detroit mob figures, Tony Provenzano and Anthony Giacalone, to resolve his disputes. Russell, as always, was supposed to be part of the arrangement. He knew the meeting was a trap. He'd seen too many men walk into similar setups, trusting that old friendships could save them. But Hoffa couldn't be convinced. He believed Russell was still on his side, still guiding him. Maybe he was, in his own way. Or maybe by then, Even Russell understood that Hoffa's fate was already sealed. On July 30th, Hoffa disappeared. He was last seen standing in the parking lot of the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. He was supposed to meet the very men he'd once trusted most. He never came home. His car was found later, doors unlocked, keys still inside. No blood, no struggle, just absence. The kind of disappearance that left echoes instead of answers. The FBI called Russell in for questioning again and again. He denied everything, calm as ever. "I don't know where he went," he said. "I like Jimmy." His tone never wavered. To the agents staring at him across the table, he seemed almost sorrowful. They want to see guilt, fear something, but all they saw was stillness. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. But every trail, every rumor, every whispered confession led back to Russell Bufalino's shadow. In the years that followed, the legend of Hoffa's disappearance grew, becoming part of American folklore. But for Russell, it was not a legend. It was a scar. Whether he ordered it or simply allowed it to happen, the silence around that day followed him for the rest of his life. Some said he mourned Hoffa privately, that he saw the tragedy as proof that the world he'd built was dying, a world where loyalty once mattered, where friendship had weight. Others said he'd accepted it as inevitable, a necessary act to restore order. Maybe both were true. Russell Bufalino had survived wars, indictments, betrayals, and exposure. But the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa would define him in the eyes of history, not as the man who killed him, but as the man who understood why he had to die. To Russell, Hoffa represented everything the old mafia feared: noise, ego, the illusion of invincibility. His fall was the price of forgetting the oldest rule of their world: silence is survival. And so, as the years passed and the rumors multiplied, Russell said nothing. He lived quietly, the same as always, his face expressionless when Hoffa's name came up. To those who asked, he'd shrug and mutter, "People disappear every day." To him, it wasn't cruelty. It was truth. The world they'd built together had no room for martyrs. Only ghosts. Russell Bufalino was both. And in the years that followed, as the old mafia began to crumble under the weight of wiretaps and betrayals, his silence remained the one thing no one could ever break. Chapter 10. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. The summer air in Michigan hung heavy, thick with heat and tension. It was late July of 1975, and the hum of cicadas blended with the sound of tires on asphalt as cars rolled through Bloomfield Township. A restaurant called the Machu's Red Fox sat quietly by the roadside, a pleasant, middle-class place where businessmen often met for lunch, its red brick walls and manicured hedges giving no hint of what would happen there. At 2 in the afternoon, a man in his early 60s stood in the parking lot, his face worn, but his energy still electric. Jimmy Hoffa checked his watch for the third time, frustration building in his chest. He'd been stood up, or so it seemed. He didn't know that this would be the last time anyone would ever see him alive. Hoffa had always been larger than life, a fighter, a symbol of working-class pride, a man who believed he could bend any situation to his will. But by 1975, he was no longer the king he once was. The Teamsters union he'd built was now run by men he despised. The mobsters he once partnered with now treated him like an inconvenience, a relic from a bygone age. Hoffa believed he could reclaim his throne. But those who knew the underworld understood that trying to take back what the mafia had already claimed was a death sentence. Russell Bufalino knew that too. In the days leading up to Hoffa's disappearance, Russell had been uneasy. He'd known Jimmy for over 20 years, knew his temper, his stubbornness, his inability to let go. Hoffa's voice had been rising again in the papers, calling out old enemies, hinting that he'd name names if he had to. It wasn't a direct threat, but in their world, even the hint of betrayal was enough to start the clock ticking. Russell had warned him countless times to stay quiet, to retire, to enjoy what was left of his freedom. But Jimmy couldn't help himself. He saw silence as defeat. For Russell, silence was the only victory that mattered. The tension between them had grown subtle, but sharp. They met a few weeks before Hoffa vanished, in a small restaurant near Detroit, far from prying eyes. Hoffa ranted for nearly an hour about Fitzsimmons, about the betrayal of his union, about the mob's interference. Russell listened, his expression unchanged, only speaking when Hoffa paused for breath. "You're fighting ghosts, Jimmy," he said softly. "You can't fight men who aren't even in the room." Hoffa slammed his fist on the table. "Then I'll bring them into the room." Russell stared at him for a long moment, the silence between them colder than the iced tea sweating on the table. "Be careful who you invite," he said finally. The meeting that would end Hoffa's life was set for July 30th. Officially, it was supposed to be a peace talk, a final attempt to resolve his feud with Tony Provenzano, a volatile New Jersey mobster and former ally. Hoffa believed the meeting could mend fences and re-establish his authority. What he didn't realize was that every man involved in arranging it already knew it was a trap. The calls were made, the drivers chosen, the location set. Russell, though not directly involved in the execution, was at the center of its orchestration. He was the man who gave permission. In the Mafia, nothing that significant happened without the blessing of men like him. That morning, Hoffa left his house wearing a dark suit and a patterned tie, the uniform of a man trying to reclaim dignity. He told his wife he was meeting Provenzano and Giacalone at the Red Fox. "Don't wait up," he said with a grin. "It won't take long." His wife smiled, thinking nothing of it. Hoffa had made hundreds of meetings like that before. But this time, the call that came hours later wasn't from Jimmy. It was from Worry. He hadn't returned. Russell spent that day traveling. He was on the road between Pennsylvania and Detroit, accompanied by his trusted driver and bodyguard, Frank Sheeran. To anyone watching, it looked like a routine trip. He attended a small family wedding that weekend, smiling for photographs, making toasts, his composure as flawless as ever. But inside, he knew the machine was already in motion. Hoffa's fate had been sealed the moment he refused to listen. Whether Russell gave the final order or simply allowed it to proceed has been debated ever since. What is certain is that when the call came to confirm the job was done, he didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. Back in Michigan, as night fell, panic began to spread. Hoffa's car was found in the restaurant parking lot, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. His friends and family began calling, searching, retracing his steps. The police took the report, but didn't take it seriously at first. Men like Hoffa had disappeared before, usually to cool off, to prove a point. But as hours turned into days, and days into weeks, the truth began to sink in. Jimmy Hoffa wasn't coming back. For the FBI, it was the biggest investigation since the Kennedy assassination. They poured resources into it. Agents, dogs, divers, helicopters. They dug up fields, drained lakes, tore apart cars, followed every rumor and lead. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen him at gas stations, at airports, in Florida, in South America. But the trail was a maze of contradictions. The one thing every investigator agreed on was that Hoffa had been betrayed by people he trusted, and that betrayal led straight into the quiet shadow of Russell Bufalino. The Bureau summoned him for questioning countless times. He never flinched. "I was at a wedding," he'd say evenly. "I didn't know Jimmy was missing." The agents pressed harder, accusing him of lying, of ordering the hit, of covering it up. Russell never raised his voice. "You've got the wrong man," he'd reply. "Jimmy was my friend." But in his world, friendship didn't mean safety. It meant inevitability. Those who couldn't adapt, who drew attention, who broke the unspoken code, had to go. Frank Sheeran, years later, would claim that he was the one who pulled the trigger. His confession came decades after the fact, long after most of the men involved were dead. Whether his account was true or self-serving remains uncertain. But his story carried details that matched the logic of Russell's style: clean, efficient, emotionless. According to Sheeran, Hoffa had been picked up under the pretense of the meeting and driven to a nearby house. There, he was led inside, realizing too late what was happening. Two men stood behind him. One was silent. The other raised a gun. There were no arguments, No goodbyes, just 2 quick shots to the back of the head. His body was never found. For Russell, the aftermath was handled with the same precision as the act itself. Loose ends were tied. Witnesses were silenced with money or fear. The narrative shifted, twisting through rumors until the truth became just another ghost story. Within months, the world had moved on, but the legend of Jimmy Hoffa had already taken on a life of its own. Books were written, movies made, theories spun. Every few years, another excavation would make headlines. A driveway, a field, a lake, each one promising answers that never came. But the real story was never buried in the ground. It was buried in silence. In private, Russell rarely spoke of Hoffa again. Those close to him said that when the subject came up, he'd simply shrug, his eyes distant, as if looking through the past instead of at it. One associate recalled asking him late one night, "Did he really have to go?" Russell took a long pause, his fingers resting on his glass. He had too many voices in his head. He said finally, "Men like that stop listening. And when they stop listening, they stop living." It wasn't cruelty. It was logic, the brutal arithmetic of a world where noise was death. The FBI never stopped circling him. They followed his every move, waiting for him to slip, for someone to talk. But Russell never did. He'd spent his life mastering the art of restraint, and Hoffa's disappearance became just another secret folded into that discipline. To the government, he was the spider at the center of the web. To the men who worked under him, he was untouchable. To those who'd once called him friend, he was the reminder that in the Mafia, there was no such thing as forever. Years passed, and time did what it always does. It dulled memory, blurred details, and turned men into myths. Hoffa's family never stopped searching. Every anniversary of his disappearance brought new headlines, new speculation, new ghosts. But Russell kept living quietly, as though nothing had changed. He'd sit on his porch in Kingston, smoking in the twilight, the hum of insects replacing the chaos of his youth. He was older now, slower, but his mind remained sharp. To the neighbors, he was just an old Italian gentleman who kept to himself. They had no idea they were living next to one of the last architects of America's criminal underworld. Sometimes he'd visit Pennsylvania diners, the kind he'd frequented his whole life, and order the same coffee he never finished. The waitresses liked him. He tipped well, spoke softly, and never complained. No one would have guessed that this quiet man once commanded the loyalty of men who could bring cities to their knees. In his silence, there was peace, but also the echo of everything he'd seen, everyone he'd lost, and everything he'd buried. Hoffa's ghost followed him, not as guilt, but as proof of how fragile power really was. Russell had outlasted nearly everyone from his era: Luciano, Genovese, Lansky, Costello, and now Hoffa. One by one, the giants had fallen, undone by greed, pride, or betrayal. And yet, he remained, not because he was the strongest or the smartest, but because he was the quietest. He never sought the spotlight, never trusted fame, never mistook fear for loyalty. He had built an empire of whispers, and even after the world had moved on, those whispers still obeyed him. In 1978, Russell was indicted for conspiracy and extortion, a rare misstep in a career defined by invisibility. The trial made headlines, but even then, he carried himself with the same calm dignity. The prosecutors called him a menace, a relic of the old Mafia order. He said little, showed less. When the verdict came down, guilty, he accepted it without reaction. To him, prison wasn't a punishment. It was just another room in the same world. He'd been living in confinement his entire life, surrounded by walls of his own making. Behind bars, he was treated with quiet respect. Even the guards seemed unsure of who he really was. He read books, walked the yard, kept to himself. Occasionally, other inmates would approach him, curious about the legends they'd heard. Russell would smile faintly, shake his head, and say, "Stories are for people who talk too much." He never confirmed or denied anything about Hoffa. He didn't need to. His silence said more than words ever could. When he was released years later, old and frail, he returned to the same small house in Kingston. He lived out his remaining years surrounded by the same stillness that had defined his life. The mafia he once helped shape was crumbling under the weight of wiretaps, betrayals, and RICO laws. The new generation didn't understand men like him, the quiet architects who built empires without being seen. But Russell didn't care. He'd already lived long enough to see the cycle complete itself. Jimmy Hoffa's name still appeared in newspapers, his disappearance still inspiring headlines and conspiracy theories. But for Russell, it was no longer a story of murder or betrayal. It was a story of inevitability, the cost of speaking too loudly in a world that punished noise. The man who had vanished into thin air had become a warning, a myth, a mirror. And in that reflection, Russell saw his own legacy. He'd survived everything: wars, raids, betrayals, time itself. But in the end, it was Hoffa's disappearance that defined him, the quiet echo that never faded. He didn't kill Hoffa, not personally, but he'd built the world that made it possible. And when the world finally turned to dust, it was his silence that remained. Russell Bufalino, the man who never needed to raise his voice, had outlasted them all. And somewhere out there, beneath concrete, under dirt, or maybe in the folds of history itself, Jimmy Hoffa's ghost still whispered the lesson Russell had lived by all his life: speak less, move quietly, and never, ever be seen coming. Chapter 11. The law closes in. The first knock came early in the morning, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to sound final. A steady rhythm, measured, polite, official. Inside the modest home in Kingston, Pennsylvania, Russell Bufalino folded his newspaper and set it aside. He already knew who it was before he opened the door. The FBI had been circling him for years, and now they were coming closer, like wolves that had finally learned patience. He straightened his tie, smoothed the front of his jacket, and opened the door to two men in dark suits, their expressions a mix of confidence and hesitation. They greeted him by name. "Mr. Bufalino, we'd like to ask you a few questions." He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth barely moving. "Of course, gentlemen. You always do." By the late 1970s, the walls around him were tightening. The silence that had protected him for decades was beginning to crack under the weight of modern investigation. Technology had evolved. The government had new weapons: wiretaps, hidden microphones, long lenses. The days when a man could vanish behind a handshake and a smile were ending. The mafia, once invisible, was now an open wound under the public's gaze. But while others panicked, Russell remained still. He'd spent his life outsmarting men louder and younger than himself. He'd learned that survival wasn't about speed, it was about calm. The FBI had built a file on him that could have crushed a lesser man. Pages upon pages of testimonies, wire reports, and surveillance logs. But the strange thing was, none of it really proved anything. Russell didn't write things down. He didn't make phone calls about business. He didn't even own property under his name that could be traced to anything criminal. The Bureau's agents called him the Ghost of Pennsylvania. He was everywhere and nowhere, always a step beyond their grasp. But ghosts, no matter how elusive, eventually cast shadows, and the FBI had decided to follow his. Their focus sharpened after Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. It was the perfect opportunity. The Bureau had public outrage, political backing, and a mystery they needed to solve. Russell was their favorite suspect, but every time they cornered him, his answers were maddeningly consistent. "I don't know. I wasn't there." Jimmy was a friend. Nothing to hold, nothing to twist. His lawyers admired his discipline. His enemies feared it. In a world where everyone eventually slipped, Bufalino's silence had become legendary. But the law had time on its side. The younger agents weren't like the old ones who'd respected the quiet rules of their generation. These men wanted results, careers built on bringing down the untouchable dons. They followed Russell relentlessly, tracking his cars, bugging his restaurants, watching who came and went. Every phone line that could be tapped was. Every conversation he had in public was recorded, analyzed, dissected. And still nothing. He was too careful. It wasn't the Hoffa case that finally cornered him. It was something smaller, almost trivial, a dispute over labor racketeering, extortion, and transportation contracts. A local businessman had complained about intimidation, claiming that union deals were being forced by threats and kickbacks. On paper, the operation looked clean, but the FBI traced the influence back to one name, Bufalino. They thought they had him. To them, it wasn't about the charges themselves. It was about making a point. Russell Bufalino wasn't going to die a free man. The indictment came in 1978. The courtroom was crowded that day, packed with reporters, agents, and curious faces. Everyone wanted to see what the quiet Don would look like under pressure. But when Russell entered, he looked no different than a man attending a funeral, composed, respectful, but detached, as though he already knew the outcome. The prosecutor painted him as the mastermind of an empire of intimidation, a criminal who had corrupted unions and industries for decades. They spoke of shadow meetings, coded messages, money changing hands in dark corners. Russell listened without expression. When his lawyer finally stood to speak, he said only, "The government has been chasing my client's shadow for 40 years. Today, they're still empty-handed." The jury didn't care about shadows. They saw a quiet old man and mistook calm for guilt. He was convicted of conspiracy and extortion and sentenced to prison. Reporters called it the fall of the last gentleman Don. But those who knew him understood that Russell hadn't fallen. He'd simply stepped out of sight again. When the guards led him away, he didn't look defeated. He looked serene, as if he'd already made peace with the next chapter of his story. Prison didn't break him. In a place built to strip men of power, Russell remained untouchable. Inmates who recognized him treated him with reverence. Guards spoke to him with a strange mixture of fear and respect. He was quiet, polite, punctual. He never asked for favors, never raised his voice. But his influence was still there, invisible and absolute. Disputes that would normally end in violence ended with a single look from him. Somehow, the world inside those walls adapted to his rhythm. It was as though the Mafia itself had shrunk to fit the size of a cell, and Russell still sat at the center of it. But time was catching up. The world outside was changing faster than he could recognize. The Mafia he'd helped build was dying, eaten alive by greed and betrayal. RICO laws gave prosecutors power like never before. Wiretaps recorded conversations that used to be sacred. Informants, men who once swore oaths of silence, were trading loyalty for leniency. Russell watched from his cell as the old world crumbled. Names that once commanded fear, Gambino, Lucchese, Genovese, were now reduced to testimonies in courtrooms. He saw what silence had protected him from all along, the noise of men destroying themselves. Every few months, the FBI would visit him in prison, hoping he'd finally talk. They offered deals, promises of comfort, even sympathy. He'd smile, shake his head, and say the same thing every time, "I've got nothing to say." To the agents, it was infuriating. To Russell, it was liberation. He'd built his life on saying nothing, and now, at the end of it all, that same silence was his final act of control. He served his sentence quietly, reading books, writing short letters, and occasionally listening to the evening news on a small transistor radio. When he was finally released in the early 1980s, he was old, frail, but unmistakably dignified. Reporters waited outside the gates, cameras flashing as he stepped into the sunlight. They shouted questions about Hoffa, about the Mafia, about his legacy. He ignored them all, walking slowly to the waiting car, his expression unreadable. Back in Kingston, he returned to the same house he'd lived in for decades. The curtains were drawn, the lawn neatly trimmed, the mailbox small and unmarked. To the neighbors, it was like he'd never left. They greeted him on the street, and he greeted them back, polite and reserved. The younger ones didn't even know who he was. To them, he was just an elderly Italian man who walked to church every Sunday and tipped well at the local diner. They had no idea they were brushing shoulders with one of the last surviving architects of organized crime in America. In those final years, Russell seemed to withdraw even further into himself. The mafia he devoted his life to was gone, replaced by chaos and ambition. The new generation didn't follow the old rules. They talked too much, acted too fast, and died too young. He saw their headlines, their arrests, their betrayals. It all confirmed what he'd always known. Power doesn't last when men can't stay silent. He'd outlasted them all by being exactly what they could never be: invisible. Occasionally, old friends would visit. They'd sit with him on the porch, reminiscing about a time when respect meant something. They'd ask him if he ever missed the old days. He'd take a long drag from his cigarette, exhale slowly, and say, "You can't miss something that never really existed." To Russell, the mafia had always been an illusion, an arrangement of trust and fear held together by silence. The moment men started believing their own myth, it began to fall apart. The FBI never stopped watching him, even in old age. His phone was tapped, his mail intercepted. They hoped he might slip, or that some late-life confession would finally close the Hoffa case. But Russell never gave them the satisfaction. When he was asked again about Hoffa in his final years, his answer was as cold as it was final. "You're still looking for a man who isn't lost. He's just gone." He knew death was close. His health was failing, his steps slower, his world smaller. Yet he faced it with the same quiet discipline that had defined his life. No fear, no regret, no confessions. Just silence. He'd lived long enough to see the empire he helped build turn to dust, and still, he remained untouched. For him, that was victory. When he died in 1994, there were no grand funerals, no parades, no speeches. His passing made barely a whisper in the papers. To most, he was a forgotten name in a long list of old gangsters. But to those who knew or who'd studied his life, his death marked the end of something greater. The end of the old mafia, the one that lived in the shadows, the one that survived by restraint. Russell Bufalino was not a man of noise, nor was he a man of blood. He was something rarer, a man who understood that true power lives in silence. Long after his death, FBI agents would still talk about him with a mix of frustration and admiration. "He was the one we could never touch," one of them said years later. "He didn't beat us because he was smarter. He beat us because he was quieter." In a world built on violence and greed, that was his genius. He had turned invisibility into immortality. Russell Bufalino's story wasn't about glory or revenge. It wasn't about crime or punishment. It was about endurance, the kind that doesn't come from muscle or fear, but from discipline. He outlasted presidents, rivals, and entire generations of lawmen. When the law finally closed in, it didn't find a monster. It found a man who had already disappeared long before they arrived. And somewhere in the long silence that followed, in the empty halls of FBI offices and the faded ink of forgotten reports, the ghost of Russell Bufalino still lingered. Not haunting, just waiting, watching, as if to remind them all that sometimes the loudest man in the room is the one you never hear. Chapter 12. The Decline of the Old Guard. The 1980s began with a hum that felt foreign to men like Russell Bufalino. The old rhythm of the underworld, slow, deliberate, built on respect and silence, was being drowned out by a new sound. Phones ringing, cameras flashing, guns barking in the daylight. The mafia was no longer the quiet empire it once was. It had become a spectacle. And for men like Russell, who had built their lives on invisibility, that noise was death. He was an old man now, his steps careful, his breath slow. Prison had aged him, though not broken him. When he walked through Kingston's narrow streets, people nodded politely, unaware that this frail figure had once brokered peace between men who ruled cities. His suits were simpler, his voice quieter, his circle smaller. But in his eyes, the same calm, steady eyes that once saw through smoke and deception, there was still sharpness. He could feel the change all around him, creeping like decay. The old ways were dying, and the men who carried them were vanishing one by one. The mafia had always been a paradox, its strength born from its secrecy, its power measured in invisibility. But the new generation of gangsters didn't understand that. They grew up on headlines and greed, wanting to be seen, wanting to be feared. They traded the quiet dignity of men, like Bufalino, for the flash of cars and cameras. It wasn't business anymore, it was theater. They wanted to be stars in a story that was never meant to have an audience. Russell watched it unfold like a man watching his own house burn down. John Gotti, the so-called Dapper Don, strutted across New York City in silk ties and fur coats, turning courtrooms into stages and cameras into mirrors. He smiled for the newspapers, gave interviews from the steps of federal buildings, and talked about honor as though it were something to sell. The public loved him. The old guard despised him. Russell said little, but when asked by a younger associate what he thought of Gotti's rise, he simply replied, "He won't die of old age." He wasn't wrong. The law had changed too. When Russell was young, the FBI was a lumbering beast, slow, predictable, easy to outthink. But the new bureau was relentless. Under the RICO Act, they no longer needed to catch a man committing a crime. They just needed to prove he was part of structure. The very thing that had made the Mafia powerful, its organization, was now its greatest weakness. The bosses who once thought themselves untouchable were being taken down by their own accountants, drivers, and cousins. Men who had sworn oaths of silence were trading secrets for leniency. The sacred word, omerta, was cracking under pressure, and once it cracked, it could never be sealed again. Russell saw it coming before most. He'd always known that the system he'd built couldn't survive in the modern world. It depended on discipline, and discipline was a dying art. Men used to understand that patience was power, that violence was a tool, not a language. But the new generation used it for punctuation. They killed to make statements, not to solve problems. He'd seen the kind of recklessness before, in the streets of Sicily, in the chaos of Prohibition, and it always ended the same way. His health was fading, but his mind remained sharp enough to see the full shape of what was coming. He read the newspapers every morning, quietly tracing the downfall of every major family. Names that once commanded fear, Colombo, Bonanno, Lucchese, were now appearing next to words like indicted, convicted, and informant. He'd shake his head, fold the paper neatly, and mutter to himself, "Too much noise." The old guard was dying not just in body, but in spirit. Carlo Gambino was gone, Frank Costello gone, Meyer Lansky gone, Vito Genovese long buried. The generation that had understood the art of power had been replaced by men who treated it like a gamble. Even the union world had changed. The Teamsters were no longer what they'd been under Hoffa. The pension funds were drained, the influence diluted. The once mighty bridge between labor and organized crime was collapsing under government scrutiny. Russell's empire, carefully built on handshakes and whispers, had become a ghost. He rarely traveled anymore, but occasionally, old allies would visit. They came not to talk business, but to talk history. They'd sit on his porch as the Pennsylvania evening settled, sharing memories that belonged to another era. They spoke of Appalachian, of Luciano, of the wars that shaped them. Some laughed at their own survival. Others didn't laugh at all. There was a sadness in those conversations, a realization that their kind of men no longer existed. "We kept the peace," one said. "Now they keep the headlines." Russell didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Even as his world faded, the government refused to forget him. Agents still watched from a distance, still filed reports on his movements, still hoped for one last revelation about Hoffa or the Mafia Commission. But there was nothing left to find. The man they were chasing was gone, replaced by an old figure whose empire had already turned to dust. He'd beaten them not by fighting, but by outliving the chase itself. He once said to a priest, during confession, that his greatest sin was patience. The priest didn't understand. Russell had used patience as both shield and weapon. He'd waited out rivals, outlasted investigations, outlived enemies. But patience also meant watching everything he'd built erode before his eyes. The priest told him to pray for forgiveness. Russell smiled and said, "For what?" "For surviving." In his final years, he spent long stretches alone. The house was quiet, filled with the faint hum of an old refrigerator and the ticking of a clock that seemed louder at night. Sometimes he'd sit by the window, looking out at the same street he'd walked for decades, thinking about the men he'd known. Some had died with honor, others in fear, but none had truly escaped. Every man in their world paid eventually, one way or another. Russell's payment had simply come slower, in solitude instead of blood. He thought often of Sicily, of Montedoro, the place where his story began. The dirt roads, the olive groves, the weight of tradition. He remembered his father's hands, rough from labor, and the voices that spoke of pride in silence as if they were prayers. It had all followed him to America, the code, the loyalty, the understanding that some truths weren't meant to be spoken. And yet, somewhere along the way, America had changed the meaning of those truths. What was once about dignity became about dominance. What was once a family became a brand. The mafia of the old guard had lived by a simple principle: control the chaos. By the time Russell reached his 80s, the chaos had learned to control itself. Cocaine had replaced loyalty. Greed had replaced restraint. The quiet meetings in diners were replaced by gunfire in nightclubs. And the men who once ruled from the shadows were being replaced by boys with no patience for shadows at all. He saw it in their eyes. The hunger, the arrogance, the belief that the world owed them something. He'd spent his life teaching the opposite. That power owed you nothing unless you earned it with silence. One evening, an old associate, one of the last still alive, visited him for coffee. The man was nervous, shifting in his chair, his hands trembling slightly. He'd heard rumors that a young boss in New York had been killed by his own men. "It's not like before," the man said. "There's no order anymore." Russell stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon tapping the cup in soft rhythm. "Order," he said, almost smiling. "Order was an illusion. We just knew how to hide the mess." The man laughed, then stopped when he realized Russell wasn't joking. By then, his name had become myth. Lawmen, historians, and journalists spoke about him with fascination. To some, he was the quiet architect of the Mafia's golden age. To others, he was a ghost, a man whose existence blurred the line between truth and rumor. But to Russell himself, he was neither. He was simply a man who'd learned how to survive in a world that punished those who didn't understand timing. Timing, he once told a young man, is the only real power. You do things too early, you're reckless. Too late, you're dead. But if you wait long enough, sometimes the world forgets what it was looking for. The world was forgetting. The FBI agents who'd once sworn to catch him had retired. The reporters who'd written his name were gone. The men who'd followed his orders were dead or imprisoned. History had moved on, chasing new criminals, new wars, new scandals. But in that small house in Kingston, one of the last surviving pieces of the old mafia still drew breath. The past was fading everywhere except in his mind. He lived long enough to see the new era of crime take shape. The rise of cartels, corporate corruption, and global networks far more ruthless than the mafia had ever been. And for the first time, he felt something close to pity. The new criminals didn't understand subtlety. They left trails. They built empires out of vanity. They mistook visibility for power. He'd spent a lifetime teaching himself to disappear, and now the world rewarded men for doing the opposite. It was the final irony. As his body weakened, the walls of his home became his final territory. He'd sit in his armchair for hours, lost in thought, the faint hum of a radio keeping him company. He didn't speak much anymore, not even to the few who still visited. But when he did, his words were still precise, still cold, still measured. "The world's not quieter," he said once. "I've just gone deaf to the noise." The decline of the old guard wasn't a single event. It was a slow erosion, a fading of discipline, a loss of identity. Russell knew it better than anyone. The mafia had once been a shadow government, a system built on honor among thieves. Now it was a headline generator, feeding on its own spectacle. The respect was gone, replaced by fame. And fame, he believed, was just another form of death. When the end finally came for him, it came without drama. No police sirens, no betrayal, no vengeance. Just a slow, quiet fading. He died as he lived, unseen. The newspapers printed short obituaries, summarizing his life in paragraphs that said everything and nothing. Reputed mafia boss, they called him. But he was more than that. He was the last craftsman of a dying art, the art of surviving in silence. As his body was lowered into the ground, there were no crowds, no cameras, no fear. Only a few old men stood by, their faces lined with time, their eyes reflecting the weight of what had been lost. The rain fell lightly, as if the earth itself was trying not to make too much noise. And in that quiet, something ended, not just a life but an era. The old guard, the architects of control, the men who ruled without being seen, they were gone. What remained were stories, fragments of whispers carried through generations, each one fading a little more with time. Russell Bufalino had once said that every empire ends the same way, not with war, but with forgetting. And as history moved forward, as his name slipped from headlines into footnotes, his prophecy came true. The old mafia didn't die with a bang. It simply disappeared, the way all things built on silence eventually do. Chapter 13. Final Years of Forgotten Dawn. The end of Russell Bufalino's story didn't come with gunfire or betrayal. It came quietly, like the slow dimming of a candle in an empty room. By the late 1980s, he was an old man, small in stature, frail in movement, but still carrying the aura of someone who had outlasted everyone who'd ever tried to control him. His hair had thinned to gray, his hand shook slightly when he lit his cigarette, and his eyes, once sharp enough to read a man's soul in a glance, had softened. But the quiet authority was still there, woven into his presence like an invisible thread. When people in Kingston saw him on the street, they didn't see a mob boss. They saw an old gentleman who nodded politely to the shopkeepers, who held doors open for women, who tipped the waitresses with exact change. Only a few remembered what he truly was. He'd seen the underworld turn to ash. The mafia of his youth, structured, disciplined, silent, had been replaced by something louder, messier, self-destructive. The headlines were filled with names like Gotti and Castellano, men who dressed like kings but ruled like children. They had traded wisdom for spectacle, respect for vanity. Russell read the papers with the same quiet disbelief, shaking his head at how quickly it had all unraveled. The code that once defined them, omerta, honor, restraint, was gone. The new generation wanted everything fast. Money, fame, fear. They didn't understand the long game, the patience that kept a man alive through decades of chaos. He used to say, "A loud man doesn't die old." And he was right. The old ways had vanished, and yet somehow he had survived them all. His home became his final fortress. The world outside moved on, but inside those modest walls, time stood still. Catherine, his wife of many years, cared for him with quiet devotion. She had lived through every whisper, every rumor, every strange phone call that ended abruptly when she walked into the room. Now she watched over him as his world shrank to the size of his living room chair and the slow ticking of the clock. He'd sit there for hours, lost in thought, a cigarette burning down to ash between his fingers. Sometimes she'd ask him what he was thinking about, and he'd give her the same small smile he'd given her for decades. "Nothing that needs to be said," he'd reply. There were still visitors, but fewer than before. Old friends, aging allies, men who spoke in half sentences and let silence finish their thoughts. They came bearing small gifts, cigars, a bottle of wine, sometimes just company. They'd sit with him at the kitchen table, the air thick with nostalgia. The conversations drifted between memory and myth. One would mention the Appalachian meeting, another the old Teamsters days, another the time the FBI nearly caught them on a wire but missed by a single word. They'd laugh softly, but the laughter carried a weight. They weren't reminiscing out of pride. They were remembering to remind themselves they had lived through something the world would never understand. Sometimes a younger man would show up, an ambitious face from a generation that still romanticized the mafia's golden age. They'd sit across from Russell, nervous but eager, asking for advice, for stories, for some kind of blessing. He'd listen quietly, letting them talk themselves out. Then, with the faintest hint of impatience, he'd say, "If you want to live, stay out of the papers." They never quite knew what to make of him. To them, he was a relic, a legend from another era. They wanted tales of power, blood, and empire. He gave them silence and subtle warnings. Most didn't come back. His health began to falter in the early 1990s. Years of stress, prison food, and cigarettes had taken their toll. The doctor visits became more frequent, the nights longer. Sometimes he'd wake up disoriented, unsure if it was day or night. Catherine would find him sitting by the window, staring out into the dark, his expression calm but distant. When she asked what he was looking for, he'd answer softly, "Just making sure the world's still there." The FBI hadn't forgotten him. Even as his body weakened, the Bureau kept their quiet watch, sending agents to observe, to note, to hope for a deathbed confession about Hoffa or the hidden structure of the Mafia's dying network. But they never got it. They'd come to his door, polite but firm, their faces eager with curiosity. "Mr. Bufalino, before you go, don't you want to set the record straight?" He'd look at them with mild amusement, as if they were children who hadn't learned when to stop asking questions. "Set it straight for who?" he'd ask. "The people who already made up their minds." Then he'd close the door, slow but deliberate, ending the conversation like he ended everyone in his life, on his own terms. To the agents, he was an enigma to the very end. The files they built over decades filled cabinets, but none of it ever amounted to certainty. Every recorded conversation was vague, every photograph inconclusive, every informant's story full of holes. Russell Bufalino remained what he had always been, a man who existed between facts, whose power lived in the spaces that couldn't be documented. One retired investigator would later say, "You could feel him in the room, but you could never prove he was there." As he grew weaker, Catherine noticed that he talked less, even to her. He'd sit quietly, listening to the radio or reading the same section of the newspaper again and again. Sometimes he'd trace his finger over the print, as if he were searching for a name he expected to see. When she pressed him, he'd just say, "Old habits die hard." Once, she found him going through a box of old photographs, faces of men long gone, names that once made entire cities tremble. He looked at each picture for a long time before burning them in the fireplace, one by one. "It's time they rested," he said softly. In those last months, Russell seemed to find a strange peace. He'd seen too much, lost too much, outlived too many. The world he'd built, the one that thrived on whispers and fear, no longer existed. What replaced it was something foreign, something noisy and fast. The new generation didn't understand that real power didn't shout, it whispered. They couldn't see the beauty in restraint, the safety in being forgotten. He felt both sadness and relief knowing that no one would ever build another empire like his. He went to church often, not out of guilt, but out of habit. The same pew, the same hour, the same small prayer whispered under his breath. The priest didn't ask questions. He'd heard the rumors, of course, but never pressed. To him, Russell was just another old man seeking grace in the twilight of his life. After confession, he'd sometimes sit in the back of the church long after the others had left, staring at the flickering candles, lost in some private reflection. One afternoon, the priest asked him if he regretted anything. Russell smiled faintly and said, "I regret trusting time. I thought it owed me something." Then he stood, adjusted his hat, and walked out into the fading light. Outside, the town of Kingston moved at its usual slow pace. People who'd known him for years still waved politely, unaware of how much history lived behind his quiet smile. Children rode bikes past his house, dogs barked in the distance, and the sun dipped behind the Pennsylvania hills. It was a fitting stage for his final act. A man who'd once controlled empires reduced to the simplicity of ordinary life, and finding comfort there. He died in February 1994, in the same quiet town where he'd built his invisible kingdom. The news didn't travel far. A few papers mentioned it, reputed mafia boss Russell Bufalino dead at 91. It was a small obituary for a man whose influence had once stretched across states. There was no fanfare, no scandal, no drama, just silence, fitting for the man who had turned it into an art form. His funeral was modest, attended by family, a few old associates, and men who had long since abandoned the life. The priest spoke kindly, referring to him as a man of faith and discipline. Outside, snow fell lightly, covering the gravestones in a thin white layer that muffled every sound. After his death, the myths began again. Some claimed he'd taken secrets to the grave that could have solved the Hoffa mystery. Others swore he confessed in private to ordering hits that changed the course of American crime. None of it could be proven, and that was exactly how he would have wanted it. Russell Bufalino had spent his life ensuring that truth was something you could never touch directly, only sense like heat from a dying flame. In the years that followed, his name faded from public memory. The world moved on, obsessed with new scandals, new villains, new headlines. The mafia itself became a relic of history, more entertainment than reality, a ghost of its former self. But for those who understood the real history, the men who had studied power, silence, and survival, Russell's story remained a lesson. He wasn't the loudest, the richest, or the most feared. He was simply the one who endured. To this day, his name still floats in the background of unsolved mysteries, whispered in documentaries, written in the margins of FBI reports that never reach conclusions. But behind all the speculation lies something simpler, something undeniable. Russell Bufalino was the last of a dying breed. A man who built power not through violence or fame, but through patience and control. If you walk through Kingston today, there's nothing to mark his presence. No plaques, no monuments, no sign that one of the most powerful figures in American organized crime once lived there. His house still stands, quiet and unassuming, its windows reflecting the trees outside. Neighbors pass it every day without realizing that behind those walls, decisions were made that shaped the entire underworld. It's poetic in a way. The invisible man remains invisible, even in death. Russell Bufalino's story doesn't end with tragedy or triumph. It ends the way all his dealings did, calmly, quietly, without spectacle. He'd once said, "Noise fades, silence lasts." And in the end, that's exactly what he left behind. A silence so complete that it became its own kind of legacy. In that silence, the old world sleeps. The world of coded handshakes, whispered names, and invisible empires. The world of men who understood that power is never about being seen. It's about being remembered by those who can't explain why they still feel your shadow. Russell Bufalino's shadow still lingers, long after his voice has vanished. It's in the spaces between stories, in the quiet moments where history forgets to look. And maybe that was the point all along. To build something that couldn't be erased, even when your name was. To disappear so completely that the world couldn't tell where the myth ended and the man began. That was Russell Bufalino's final gift to history, an ending that wasn't really an ending at all. Just another silence, stretching into forever. Chapter 14. Legacy of Russell Bufalino. For most people, legacy is a word reserved for the famous, for the loud, for those who leave monuments and headlines behind. But for Russell Bufalino, legacy was something else entirely. His power lived in silence, and so would his memory. He didn't need statues or stories told in his name. His legacy was invisible, built on the echoes of fear, respect, and control that continued long after he was gone. In a world obsessed with noise, he had proven that true power makes no sound. After his death in 1994, there was a strange stillness in Kingston. For years, his house had been a quiet hub of whispers and visits, of late-night drives and discreet meetings that no one ever saw. When he was gone, the traffic stopped. The curtains stayed drawn, the phone lines went silent, and the town returned to being what it had always pretended to be, ordinary. To outsiders, it was just another small Pennsylvania community. But to those who'd lived long enough to remember, there was a sense that something had vanished, a presence, a kind of quiet authority that had kept even chaos in order. They didn't speak his name, not out of fear, but out of habit. Silence had been his rule, and even in death, it was honored. The FBI archives eventually closed the active files on Bufalino. There was nothing left to pursue, no living witnesses, no confession, no final proof. The Hoffa case remained unsolved. The Union connections faded into history, and the network of influence he had once controlled had dissolved into the past. Yet the Bureau still kept a section labeled Bufalino Crime Family, a reminder of a time when the smallest man in the room could hold entire states in his palm. Agents who studied his case years later couldn't help but admire the precision with which he'd lived his life. One report described him as the most disciplined, organized crime figure in American history. It wasn't meant as praise, but it might as well have been. Russell's legacy was not measured by violence, but by restraint. In an era defined by greed and spectacle, he had chosen invisibility and patience. He never sought to be the richest or the most feared. He wanted to be the last one standing. And in that, he succeeded. The empire he built didn't die when he did. It simply transformed. The systems he created, the control over unions, the quiet infiltration of legitimate businesses, the strategic use of loyalty and leverage, outlived the man himself. They became part of the DNA of American organized crime, absorbed and imitated by those who came after him, even if they never knew his name. In a way, his methods predicted the future. The modern world, with its digital anonymity and silent control through information and influence, reflected the same philosophy he had lived by. He believed that power wasn't about visibility, it was about reach. The men who sought fame died young, but the ones who moved unseen could shape the world without leaving fingerprints. The same principle that kept him alive through the 20th century now lived on in corporations, politics, and networks far beyond the Mafia. His legacy wasn't just criminal, it was structural. Historians would later struggle to define him. To some, he was the embodiment of the invisible Don, the man who ruled without being known. To others, he was an anomaly, a contradiction who seemed to defy the very nature of organized crime. He had no mansion, no flashy cars, no newspaper clippings celebrating his power. His home was modest, his friends few, his habits simple. Yet every major event in American Mafia history between the 1940s and the 70s had his shadow somewhere in it. He didn't lead by fear, but by consistency. He didn't demand loyalty. He earned it by giving it sparingly. To those who served him, Russell wasn't just a boss. He was the embodiment of balance. Even within the Mafia itself, his name carried weight long after his death. In quiet circles, old men would still mention him when talking about how things used to be. They spoke of him the way soldiers speak of generals, without exaggeration, just reverence. Bufalino, they'd say, he was the last one who did it right. The new generation, the ones raised on headlines and chaos, couldn't understand it. They wanted to know why men feared someone who rarely raised his voice. They wanted to know how someone could control so much without ever needing to prove it. They didn't understand that fear isn't always born from threats. Sometimes it's born from the absence of emotion, from the calmness of a man who never flinches. In the broader story of American crime, Russell's legacy exists between the lines. The newspapers wrote about the flamboyant ones, the goddess, the Capones, the flamboyant empires that crashed and burned in front of cameras. But history has a way of favoring the quiet. In the decades that followed, as researchers dug deeper into declassified files and core documents, they began to realize how deep his influence went. He had been there at every major turning point: Prohibition, the labor rackets, the commission's rise, the fall of Hoffa, the shift into legitimate businesses. He was a constant through it all, the thread that connected eras. And yet, he never once stepped fully into the light. There's a strange irony in how he's remembered. The man who avoided fame in life found it in death, thanks to film and fiction. Martin Scorsese's The Irishman brought his name back to the surface, introducing him to a generation that had never heard of him. In that film, portrayed by Joe Pesci, Bufalino was shown not as a monster, but as a quiet, calculating figure, an old-world Don with patience and grace, a man who led not by volume, but by certainty. The portrayal was accurate in spirit, though simplified for storytelling. Still, it did something Russell himself never would have allowed. It made him visible. For a time, the renewed attention turned his name into a kind of fascination. People began searching for photographs, for stories, for any trace of the real man. But even then, they found almost nothing. A handful of black and white images, a few grainy FBI surveillance shots, and transcripts of court proceedings where he said almost nothing at all. He had erased himself so thoroughly that even history struggled to reconstruct him. The more they searched, the more they found that his absence was the essence of his presence. He'd become, in a way, a legend defined by what wasn't there. To those who truly understood him, that was the point. Russell Bufalino didn't want to be remembered as a man. He wanted to be remembered as an idea, a lesson in discipline, silence, and survival. He used to tell his closest associates, "If they know your name, you've already lost." He meant it literally. Every mobster who sought fame eventually paid for it. Every one of them ended in prison, a courtroom, or a grave. But Russell walked a different path. He never wanted applause, only longevity. He once said, "The secret to staying free is to act like you don't exist." And somehow, he managed to live that secret to the very end. There was a melancholy dignity to the way he existed in people's memories. The few who knew him personally described him as both kind and terrifying, a man who would listen to your troubles one moment and decide your fate the next without raising his voice. He believed in fairness, but fairness in his world didn't mean mercy. It meant balance. If you broke the code, you paid for it. If you kept the code, you prospered. His justice was simple, efficient, and final. The true measure of his legacy isn't found in police files or in crime anthologies. It's found in what he left behind, the blueprint of a system that survived decades of wars, betrayals, and law enforcement campaigns. He showed that crime could be corporate before corporations learned to be criminal. His approach to management, delegation, and trust reads more like a business manual than a gangster's playbook. Even his enemies admitted that he was more strategist than criminal. He treated the Mafia not as a brotherhood of violence, but as an institution that required order to survive. But Russell's legacy isn't just organizational. It's philosophical. He represented a version of America that existed in the gray, the place between corruption and survival, between power and anonymity. He was the son of immigrants who learned that silence was safety, that humility was a disguise, and that influence didn't need recognition. In him, the old Sicilian code found its purest American form. He was proof that you could build an empire in plain sight, as long as no one believed you were powerful enough to have one. Even now, his story continues to echo in the most unlikely places. Law schools study his tactics to understand how organized crime adapted to law enforcement. Political analysts compare his quiet diplomacy to statesmen who rule by subtle influence rather than force. Psychologists cite him as an example of control through emotional restraint. His life has become more than a story of crime. It's a study in human nature. But for all his influence, the tragedy of Russell Bufalino's legacy lies in its loneliness. He survived everything: wars, indictments, betrayal. But in the end, survival came at a cost. The people who loved him grew old and faded. The friends who once shared his world vanished into graves or prison cells. When he died, there were no heirs to carry on his empire, no sons to inherit his mantle. He'd outlasted everyone but himself. It's what he wanted, and yet it left him a relic in a world that no longer understood him. In the quiet corners of Kingston, there are still traces of him. The faint smell of cigar smoke that never seems to fade from his old porch. The stories whispered in diners by men too old to forget. They talk about how he could end wars with a single phone call, how he could make enemies vanish without leaving a mark, how the most dangerous thing about him was how ordinary he looked. For them, his name is a kind of ghost story, one told softly, out of respect. Russell Bufalino's legacy endures not because of what he did, but because of how he did it. He didn't chase power. He became power. He didn't demand respect. He earned it by never losing control. His empire was not made of buildings or money. It was made of silence, trust, and timing. And long after the noise of his world faded, that silence remained, echoing across generations like a lesson carved into the shadows. He was the last architect of the old mafia, the final keeper of a code that valued invisibility over infamy. His story is not about crime, but about the cost of survival in a world where every sound can be your undoing. The men who came after him forgot that truth. The world that replaced his didn't deserve it. And so his legacy lingers in the quiet places, the empty tables of old diners, the closed blinds of forgotten homes, the unmarked lines of forgotten reports. Russell Bufalino's story doesn't end with death. It ends the way he lived, unspoken, unseen, and perfectly intact. Because for a man who made silence his kingdom, the greatest legacy of all is that no one ever really heard him coming. Chapter 15. The myth, the mystery, the mafia's shadow. History has a strange way of choosing its ghosts. Some it drags into the spotlight, forcing them to burn bright and fast before fading into infamy. Others it leaves in the dark, allowing them to move through time unseen, their influence stretching far beyond their flesh. Russell Bufalino belonged to the second kind, the invisible ghost who never asked to be remembered, yet never truly disappeared. His story didn't end with his death. In many ways, that was when it began to take shape as myth, as something larger than the man himself. The mafia was changing, history was rewriting itself, and somewhere in the background, the shadow of Russell still lingered, a reminder of when silence ruled the underworld. The years after his passing were strange ones for organized crime. The mafia that had once dictated the rhythm of America's cities was fading fast. The FBI had won the war on paper, and the few families that remained were fractured, desperate, and exposed. The streets that had once belonged to quiet figures like Bufalino were now crowded with imitators, reckless men who confused chaos for power, greed for greatness. The code of omerta was gone, and in its place was something weaker, something that couldn't survive the pressure of a world that now recorded every word and watched every move. Yet even as the old empire collapsed, whispers of the men who built it refused to die. And at the center of those whispers, there was always the same name, spoken softly, almost respectfully: Russell. The FBI's files remained open for years after his death, not because they expected new evidence, but because no one wanted to close a case they never solved. The Hoffa mystery still haunted the Bureau's halls like a cold draft, its edges frayed with speculation. Every decade brought a new theory, a new confession, a new excavation that promised closure but delivered only dirt. Russell's name surfaced each time, and each time it slipped away like smoke. No fingerprints, no body, no witness who lived long enough to talk. He had orchestrated his world so perfectly that even his enemies couldn't untangle it. Some said he'd made a deal with the devil. Others said he'd simply understood the one truth no one else did. That power wasn't about control. It was about being untouchable. In the years that followed, the mythology around Bufalino grew in strange directions. To academics, he became a case study in leadership, the embodiment of strategic minimalism. To journalists, he was a puzzle with missing pieces, a man whose every confirmed act hinted at 20 more they couldn't prove. To the public, especially after the Irishman reignited interest, he became the symbol of the quiet dawn, the unseen architect of American organized crime. But to those who still live by the old code, the ones who remember the world before it collapsed, he was something deeper. He was the ghost of order, the last man who knew how to hold the storm together. There's a story that circulates among the few who still speak of him, one that's half memory, half parable. They say that not long before his death, a young law student wrote him a letter. The student had been researching the history of labor unions and organized crime, fascinated by how men like Bufalino had influenced the nation's economy. In the letter, he asked one simple question: "What do you think your legacy will be?" Weeks later, the letter returned, with only one sentence typed neatly at the bottom: "A man who stayed where he was supposed to." Whether the story is true or not doesn't matter. It feels true because it fits him. Russell never wanted to expand endlessly, to conquer everything. He believed power was strongest when it stayed invisible, rooted, consistent. He stayed where he was supposed to, quietly in control of the world beneath the noise. What made Russell different wasn't what he did, it was how he did it. Most men in the Mafia sought immortality through fear or wealth. Russell achieved it through absence. His genius was in subtraction, in removing himself from every place he didn't need to be. He turned invisibility into a weapon and anonymity into a throne. His operations were small, clean, and efficient. He never overreached, never left traces, never made enemies he couldn't turn into allies. The empire he ruled wasn't one of territory or blood. It was an empire of trust. The people who worked under him feared him not because he was violent, but because they understood that he saw everything. His punishment was rarely physical. It was exile, silence, disappearance. For Russell, erasure was the ultimate form of justice. Even now, the line between the man and the myth blurs. Some say he was the real power behind the Genovese family in its later years, the quiet voice that balanced New York's chaos from afar. Others insist that he was more like a consigliere to the entire American Mafia, a hidden figure who settled disputes, moved money, and made problems vanish. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. Russell's greatest skill was making everyone believe he was less than he was. That illusion of smallness gave him the room to operate on a scale that few could comprehend. He wasn't the kind of man who declared control. He simply had it. In the decades since his death, the Mafia's image has shifted from power to nostalgia. Films and television shows turned men like him into characters, their cruelty softened by charisma, their crimes romanticized by distance. But Russell's story resists that transformation. There's nothing cinematic about him, nothing loud or theatrical. His legacy doesn't belong to Hollywood. It belongs to history's blind spots, to the quiet places where truth hides. He doesn't fit the mold of the movie mobster because he was the opposite of one. He didn't chase money. He managed it. He didn't flaunt violence. He controlled it. And he didn't rule through fear. He ruled through inevitability. The deeper historians dig into his life, the clearer it becomes that Russell Bufalino wasn't just a product of his era. He was its engineer. The modern mafia structure that emerged after Prohibition, the one that replaced chaos with councils, that balanced regional power like a corporate boardroom, bore his fingerprints. His influence ran beneath the surface of every major decision from the 1940s through the 70s. When the Mafia expanded west into Vegas, Russell's connections in the unions paved the way. When the Commission resolved disputes without war, it was because men like him had made diplomacy an art form. When the FBI finally broke the mob's spine in the 80s, they were dismantling a machine that Russell himself had helped design. He didn't invent the Mafia. He perfected its silence. There's a kind of poetry in the way his life fades into uncertainty. He's both real and unreal, documented yet unknowable. To understand Russell Bufalino is to understand the nature of power itself, that it exists best when it isn't seen. The men who replaced him never learned that lesson. They wanted headlines, attention, validation. They wanted to be kings in a country that hated monarchs. Russell had no such delusions. He didn't want to be king. He wanted to be the whisper in the king's ear. And long after the thrones fell, the whispers remained. It's easy to mistake his restraint for coldness, but those who were close to him spoke of moments of surprising warmth. He loved jazz records, black coffee, and crossword puzzles. He had a dry sense of humor that surfaced when least expected. Once, when asked by an associate how he managed to stay alive so long, he smiled and said, "I never sat next to anyone who liked to talk." Behind that humor was a truth deeper than any criminal code. Talking was death, not just for mobsters, but for anyone who confused attention with safety. Russell's silence wasn't emptiness. It was armor. The last true trace of him in the public record came years after his death, in an unsealed court document from an old RICO investigation. Buried in the appendix was a brief statement from a former associate. "Bufalino taught me that the best way to lead is to make people forget you're leading." That one line captures everything about him. He didn't build his legacy by forcing his name into the story. He built it by ensuring the story couldn't exist without him, even if no one noticed. Today, the world remembers the Mafia through the noise it made: gunshots, trials, betrayals. But Bufalino's kind of power lives in the spaces between those sounds. Every quiet handshake in a back room, every deal made over coffee at a roadside diner, every union contract that shifted millions without a trace. That was his symphony. And though his orchestra has long since dispersed, the echoes of that music still hum faintly in the background of American power. It's in the way influence hides behind institutions, the way control wears a smile, the way silence can move mountains while noise only shakes the air. Russell Bufalino's myth endures because it feels like something that can't happen anymore. In a world addicted to visibility, his invisibility feels almost supernatural. The idea that a man could control so much without leaving a digital footprint seems impossible now. Yet it happened. He existed in the shadows between eras, at a time when men could vanish by choice, when power could be both absolute and unseen. That's why his story feels less like history and more like folklore. A cautionary tale wrapped in calm wisdom. Some say the Mafia died with him. That's not true. It simply changed shape, absorbed into the fabric of everything else: politics, corporations, quiet corruption. What Russell represented was not just a criminal underworld, but a philosophy. The belief that control belongs to those who understand patience, that strength is quiet, that the loudest man in the room is always the weakest. His life proved that the art of staying invisible is the rarest form of survival. When people speak of him now, they speak softly. There's no anger, no worship, just curiosity. They wonder how a man could hold so much power and leave so little behind. But that was always his final act: to live so carefully that even memory could only grasp at him in pieces. To be a ghost not because he vanished, but because he was never truly seen. If Russell Bufalino's story teaches anything, it's that history doesn't belong to the loud. It belongs to those who learn to disappear without losing themselves. His name might fade, his deeds might blur, but the structure he left behind, the discipline, the code, the silence, will always be there, buried under the noise of every era that comes after. In the end, his myth is not one of violence or mystery, but of mastery, the mastery of himself, his instincts, and the world around him. The Mafia's shadow didn't die with him. It merely grew quieter, thinner, woven into the background of modern life. And somewhere in that stillness, in the spaces where no one thinks to look, the spirit of Russell Bufalino remains, calm, invisible, and eternal. Because the truth about power, as he always knew, is that it never really dies. It just learns to whisper.